You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast.
Hello, David.
Hello, Will.
And hello, listeners. Welcome to the Common Descent Podcast, where we discuss all sorts of fun fossil and paleo topics. This is episode 249, and we will be discussing sexual dimorphism.
Well, what's that?
Sexual dimorphism is one of the more fun traits of nature, where very, very often in many species, the male and females of the species look or are biologically distinct.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll be discussing what varieties of differences we can see between males and females, how this affects their survival, why you would want to do this evolutionarily, and then the ever fun question of, do we see this in the fossil record? How can we tell if it's happening in the fossil record? And what does that mean evolutionarily?
Yeah, and are we right?
Yes.
There's gonna be that's the big question.
There's a lot of that this episode.
The question of, can we tell from fossils? And then the follow-up question, can we actually tell from fossils?
Yep. And that sometimes is the case for modern as well. This is one of those that seems real straightforward, and then we get into the weeds real quick with how weird this can get.
Well, this is one of those really fun topics where we get to start with what seems like an obvious dichotomy, the two sexes, and then real quickly discover that that's not actually how it works.
Yep.
Because nature does not do dichotomy.
No.
Nature does not do binaries.
This will be a super fun topic, and we'll be discussing it because it was requested, as all our topics are. This episode was requested by Lucas, Jonathan, Carissa, Nyan Deje, Gazeboist, Sarah May, Sal, Tracy, and Taterboy.
Thank you all for your request. We're going to have a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Before we get into the meat of the episode, we'll have our news. And before we get into our news, we have our announcements. Our first announcement, as always, is that we have a Patreon.
Sure do.
Support from our patrons helps this podcast run almost top to bottom. And when you sign up to support us on Patreon, you can get lots of extra goodies, extra content, bonus audio and info from us, live streams, gifts, and at certain levels, your name shouted out in gratitude here at the beginning of the episode. So we would like to thank Ashley, Neil, Ben, and Fastidious Flamingo.
Welcome and thank you for your incredible support, almost from the very beginning of the podcast.
Yes.
Patreon has been our primary source of financial support for Common Descent, and we are eternally grateful.
It's awesome. Makes huge difference. As for our other announcements, we have some cool stuff coming up and some things that have recently come out. We're at the beginning of the month. We just wrapped up Croc and Snake Month, so you can go find all that content. We also just released our most recent episode of Bricks with Mask, where I finally built the Godzilla, so you can see it in all its glory.
You can watch Will be real happy.
Oh, it's so nice.
Just a little birthday present to himself.
That's why it counted as the Croc build, is because it was for me.
Yes. Also on the Common Descent YouTube channel, we have officially launched Pokemon Sand and Bone, a series where I come up with ideas for Pokemon inspired by Earth history. When this episode comes out, the first 2 episodes of the series will be out on YouTube, and the first 3 episodes will be out on Patreon, where you can watch Pokemon Sand and Bone and Bricks with Bask ad-free, and there's some bonus content up there on the Patreon as well.
There's also people who have been talking about it in the Discord and in the comments, so you can join in with all the Pokemon fan energy that these episodes have been stirring up.
There was someone who left a comment on the trailer for Pokemon Sand and Bone that said, "Is this your answer to Will's Bricks with Bask?" I was like, "Yep, 100%." So we both get to do our nerd stuff.
Well, and we can fusion when I start building some of these in Lego.
Yeah. Speaking of nerd stuff, this episode is at the beginning of August, and at the beginning of September is DragonCon.
It's coming up. It's back, and we will be there again. We've already gotten our hesitant panelists, so we won't announce them yet until they're officialized, but there's some good ones in the lineup.
Yeah. So if you are in the Atlanta area that first weekend in September, we will be there for the entirety of DragonCon. Come say hi.
Absolutely. So we'll see anyone there that's there, and the rest of you will tell you about how much fun it was, because it's always so much fun. And with that, we can wrap up our announcements and move on to the news section. Every episode, we like to gather some recent scientific newses from the science world to help us all stay up to date in what's going on in paleontology and biology and so forth. David, why not just start us off?
I would love to start us off. Actually, I'm going to throw us for our first news segment over to an interview we prepared earlier with dinosaur paleontologist Steve Brusatte, who has a new book coming out called The Story of Birds. Steve was kind enough to hop on the podcast and join us to talk about this new book. So take it away, us, from when we did that interview.
Steve, start us off.
Hello, Steve.
Hi, guys. Excited to be here to talk about dinosaurs and birds.
Thank you very much for joining us. We are indeed here to talk specifically about your book, but before we get to the book, if you would please introduce yourself for our listeners.
I am Steve Brusatte. I'm a paleontologist, and I am a professor at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. I'm joining you from Illinois, where I'm chatting with you back home visiting family. I grew up in the Midwest, but I've lived in Scotland for quite a long time now, and I get to dig up dinosaurs and teach fantastic students in Edinburgh and write pop science books on the side. And I'm just very excited about fossils as I've been since I've been a teenager.
Incredible. And this new book is not your first book. You've written at least two other sort of big deal, well-acclaimed books.
Oh, thank you. I've written a few pop science books. So The Story of Birds, the new one, is really the third in a sequence. I wouldn't call it a trilogy or anything, but I did one on dinosaurs called The Rise and Fall of the Dinosaurs. And I did one on mammals called The Rise and Reign of the Mammals. And really, these three books are about the history of dinosaurs, mammals, and birds, the long-term evolutionary trajectory of each group, where they came from, how they changed and adapted over time, how they dealt with a changing climate and a changing planet and volcanoes and asteroids and extinctions and all the whims of fate and chance and evolution. And I love writing these kind of books because they're not academic books. I do plenty of that kind of writing for my my real job, but these are meant for the public. These are meant for broad audiences, and I try to make them fun and engaging and relatable and personable. But ultimately, what I try to do with these books is articulate evolution to the public, which I absolutely love doing.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Well, we certainly appreciate that as a goal. Can you give us the elevator pitch? What is this book about? If our listeners are inclined after this interview to go check out this book, what can they expect?
Well, you must check out the book if I do a good job here in this conversation and rope you in. But I think really the subject speaks for itself. This book is about birds. It's about the 150 million year evolutionary story of birds. From the beginning, from when birds originated from their dinosaur ancestors. That's a big part of this book, is presenting this idea to the public that today's birds really are dinosaurs. The book unpacks what that means. Really, it's quite simple. Birds evolved from other dinosaurs. They're part of the dinosaur family tree. They're just a peculiar group of dinosaurs that flies and lives on today. But the beginning part of the book is all about the origin story of birds. And then the book follows birds over 150 million years, as many birds lived alongside other dinosaurs for tens of millions of years. There were birds flapping and flying and soaring and fluttering and gliding over the heads of T-Rex and Triceratops and the classic dinosaurs. Then the asteroid came down. It wiped away all the dinosaurs except for birds. I tell that story in the book, why birds were the only dinosaurs to survive, or why we think that's the case, because many things in evolution, especially over evolutionary history, we're dealing with the fossil record, which is fickle, and there's uncertainties and there's biases, and every new discovery can tell you something new. But I try to go into that story of why birds were able to endure the asteroid. And then after the asteroid, for the last 66 million years, birds have been evolving and adapting and spreading around the world. And the modern groups of birds that we all know and love, whether it's penguins, whether it's parrots, whether it's pelicans or anything in between, they came out of this crucible of evolution over the past 66 million years. They live on today, of course, as the birds we know, but there have been many fantastic birds that have lived over the last few tens of millions of years that didn't quite make it to the modern day. Terror birds and elephant birds and demon ducks and all kinds of sublime birds that we only know of through fossils. So I go into those birds as well. And then, of course, I end in the modern day with some of the spectacular things birds can do for their intelligence and cognition and songs and migrations and so on. So it was a lot of fun to write it. I learned a lot doing it, and I've gained just a much greater appreciation for birds and how stunning really they are and how we should appreciate them.
Very cool.
Yeah, it really does sound like this book is kind of a love letter to birds as an evolutionary lineage.
It certainly is. And I'll admit, when I was growing up here in northern Illinois, when I was young, I was kind of afraid of birds. And I don't know why. I think I can remember a few birds like getting into the house, and in hindsight, I mean, these were like, sparrows, robins.
Sure.
They were not scary at all, but there was just something about them being in the house when you're a little kid. They're flying around, they're in your bedroom. So I was quite scared of birds for a long time. But then as a paleontologist, I've studied the theropod dinosaurs, the meat-eating. I've studied the theropod dinosaurs, the meat-eating dinosaurs, the ones that gave rise to birds. That's really my academic bread and butter. Animals like T-Rex and Velociraptor and their anatomy and their biology and their family tree. That's what my PhD thesis was on. That's what a lot of my research has been on. So as I've studied the animals that gave rise to birds, and I've studied fossil birds, it's led me back now to modern birds, and I think I appreciate them better. I'm certainly not as scared of them as I used to be. At least things like robins and sparrows. When it comes to cassowaries and those kind of birds, it's a whole different story. But no, the birds around us today, there's over 10,000 species. And they do so many things, and they live in so many places, and they are so intelligent. And when it comes down to it, they are modern day dinosaurs. These are dinosaurs that share the world with us. And more than anything, that is why I find birds so fascinating. They are the last holdouts of the great dinosaur empire, this empire that I've studied as a paleontologist.
Yeah.
I appreciate focusing on that, because so often you hear things that, will address that to a degree, but they stop at they came from dinosaurs, which feels like it is insinuating they are something else. And it's like, no, they are the dinosaurs. They are our dinosaurs. Like, we have them still today, and we live alongside them. We have them as pets. We eat them. We go watching for them. We interact with dinosaurs still today, and it's the birds.
Absolutely. And you guys, you're the Common Descent podcast, and it all comes down to descent. It comes down to the family tree. And it is weird to think about birds as dinosaurs. I get it. When most of us think of dinosaurs, even me, as somebody who studies dinosaurs, if I hear that word, my mind immediately goes to T-Rex or Brontosaurus or Stegosaurus or Triceratops, one of these giant primeval monsters that lived tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years ago. And that's true. There were so many dinosaurs that lived long ago, and many of them were big. And really, birds don't look anything like a T-Rex or a Triceratops, but the dinosaurs were a very diverse family and a very long-lived family. The same way that mammals, our group, is a very diverse family. And we are a mammal, but we don't look like an elephant. We don't look like a whale. We don't look like a dog. Of course not. We're all different groups among this great family. And the way we should think about birds, really, is birds are part of the dinosaur family tree. They evolved from other dinosaurs. They are very much dinosaurs, the same way that a bat is a mammal. Yes, a bat is a weird mammal. It has wings, it flies, but it is a mammal nonetheless, because it evolved from other mammals. It has hair and molar teeth and feeds its babies milk. It does all the things mammals do because it is a mammal. And birds are a peculiar subgroup of dinosaurs that got small, started to fly. They are dinosaurs nonetheless, but the big thing that trips us up really is all the other dinosaurs died with the asteroid. So if you imagine, it's kind of morbid because it would mean we would be extinct, but if you imagine a world where all the mammals were dead except for bats, That's really where we're at today. Most of the dinosaurs are gone, but dinosaurs do live on in this one form of birds.
Yeah. So it sounds like very clearly there's a lot here in this book to be learned about birds and about dinosaurs by people who might not have that depth of knowledge. But I know that we have a lot of listeners
Mm.
of this podcast who are bird fans and dinosaur fans. What is there in this book for people who already are familiar with these groups? Are there new perspectives? Are there new insights?
I've not written the book for other paleontologists. I'll tell you that. Some,
Sure.
other academic paleontologists, maybe they'll enjoy the story. I do tell stories of field work and discoveries and some of the historical figures from the field. And I talk about how some of these theories emerged over time. And that maybe will be interesting to other scientists. But really, this book is for a broad audience. And when I was writing it, I kept in mind a few different kind of subcategories of that broad audience. Number one are bird watchers. I mean, there are so many people today that enjoy going out and looking at birds, seeing birds, hearing their songs, making a list, trying to see as many as they can. But I think in the bird watching community, maybe some bird watchers don't know so much about where birds came from, what birds were doing millions of years ago. Maybe some bird watchers have heard of this theory that birds are dinosaurs or birds came from dinosaurs. I very much want to give that deep time appreciation, origin story of birds for people that love birds today. Conversely, for people that are dino geeks, people that are into fossils, that crowd, a crowd I know well because that's what I was when I was a teenager, an absolute dino geek. I want to convey that dinosaurs still do live on, that prehistoric past that we are so engrossed with, that just inspires us so much. When we go to a museum, we stand under a T-Rex. That past has a link to today. There are still dinosaurs with us. So I was thinking of those sorts of broader audiences when I was writing. It's not a textbook. I try to keep the academic jargon limited. I try to make it personal and relatable. But what I try to do more than anything is just convey that awesome story of 150 million years of evolution and how dinosaurs really have reached the modern day as these amazing birds that live all around us. As you say, birds that we see, birds that we hear, birds that we keep as pets, birds that we eat. They are all dinosaurs. I think that's just fascinating.
In preparing for your appearance here, I was thinking about our we did an episode on the podcast about the evolution of birds, where we talked about the origin of birds. That was episode 37, way back in 2018. And obviously, a single podcast episode is not going to be as in-depth as a book regardless. But that was also almost a decade ago. And I'm curious to know how much of what's in this book relies on research and discoveries from the last decade.
The science of paleontology moves fast. Really, all sciences are moving fast these days. So we're always learning new things. And as paleontologists, we're always finding new fossils. I mean, we really are like detectives going out looking for clues. And every time we find a new one, it potentially can change the story. So we have learned a lot over the past decade or so, certainly since you did that early episode back in 2018. It's not changed the main storyline. It's not like we've only learned recently that birds evolved from dinosaurs. No, that idea actually goes back to the time of Darwin. It was Thomas Henry Huxley in the 1860s that came up with the idea. In his later editions of The Origin of Species, Darwin himself wrote about how birds came from the reptiles via these dinosaur ancestors. So that the major idea, the take-home message that birds are dinosaurs, that's not new, that's not changed. But what has changed is we've found a lot of new fossils. We've gained a greater appreciation for how some of these classic features of birds, like feathers and wings, actually evolved in their dinosaur ancestors for reasons unrelated to flight. And we've learned a lot about that over the past 8 to 10 years. We've also collected as a community, some of my colleagues have collected some really important fossils of birds that were living right at the end of the Cretaceous, between 66 and 69 million years ago, the last few million years before the asteroid. And these fossils really show that modern style birds like the duck and chicken group, they were starting to thrive around that time. So that's something we didn't really know earlier, and that helps us better understand or better untangle this mystery of why birds, or some birds, were able to survive the asteroid. Those are some of the things that probably you wouldn't have been able to say a whole lot about back in 2018. but we now know more about them. And of course, 10 years from now, if somebody else does a book about birds and dinosaurs and the evolutionary history of birds, there'll be more fossils, there'll be more theories, there'll be more studies, and we'll have a much clearer picture, probably, hopefully, of how birds evolve. But I don't think anything at this point is going to falsify that theory that birds came from dinosaurs. It's pretty ironclad as far as evolutionary theories go.
Absolutely.
So the title of the book, once again, is The Story of Birds, a new history from their dinosaur origins to the present. As you explained, this book doesn't stop with the asteroid impact. It continues following the bird evolutionary story all the way to today, which brings me to one more question, Steve. Do you have a favorite living species of birds?
Yes, I do. And it's actually my second favorite dinosaur. People ask me all the time about my favorite dinosaur, and it's T-Rex. I know that's kind of cliched. But when I was 16 years old, the Field Museum in Chicago, they put Sue the T-Rex on display. And this was just a foundational moment in my teenage years. So I love T-Rex. I've studied T-Rex. You can't go wrong with
T-Rex it's just such a cool animal.
It's
really just cool. Undeniably so awesome.
It is. I mean, it's the size of a bus, head the size of a bathtub, crushed the bones of its prey, and it was smart. It had a big brain, it had keen senses, but those pathetic little arms. I mean, come on, it's a feat of evolution. But people ask me, my favorite dinosaur, I say T-Rex, but then I'll say my second favorite dinosaur is a gold crest. And that's a modern bird. So that, I guess, by default would make it my favorite bird. And the gold crest is the smallest bird that lives in Europe. It's not quite as small as some of the hummingbirds we have here in North America, and I'd see hummingbirds growing up. But the gold crest, it's about the size of a golf ball. It weighs about as much as a single grape, and it is a fast, active, energetic, smart little bird. And there was a nest outside of our kitchen window a few years back, right around the time my own little boy was very, very young. And I would see this mother gold crest come out from the nest and collect bugs for her babies to bring back to them in the nest, and while I was making breakfast for my son. So there's something very kind of cosmically interconnected there. So I've always loved the gold crest just because it was so fascinating to look at this tiny, beautiful little bird, this little mother going about her maternal duties, feeding her babies as I was making my boy breakfast.
That's great. And having not read through this book myself just yet, does the gold crest get a mention in the book?
Absolutely it does. And an author never wants to give away the end of a book, but it's not like a mystery novel or something. We kind of know how it ends. Birds survive the asteroid. There's 10,000 species today. So towards the end, I do talk about the gold crest and the story I'm telling you now about how I would watch this mother collect food for her babies, and how that was kind of a first full circle moment, but also how it showed to me both how fragile birds are today and some of the threats they're undergoing, but also just how incredible it is that you have these primeval dinosaurs, the T-Rex group of dinosaurs, give rise to birds. And some of these things are as small as a golf ball. They are dinosaurs. They are real modern day dinosaurs. And the gold crest just drives home, not just the birds are dinosaurs, but how amazing it is, how amazing evolution is, what evolution can do over long time scales, taking a group like the dinosaurs and through millions of years of natural selection, of adaptation, of resiliency, of turning these dinosaurs into these tiny little birds that we know.
Yeah, they really are a great example of the versatility with it. They've done just about everything you can think of them doing with the features they've developed, like their feathers they've gone crazy with, their beaks, their sizes, their everything. They have gotten so creative in their diversity. It's awesome.
They certainly have. And I think there was a reason that Darwin, when he was coming up, developing the theory of evolution by natural selection, that he was so enamored with pigeons. First of all, he kept pigeons and bred pigeons. Mm-hmm. And then also, of course, the finches, not quite technically finches, but we call them Darwin's finches from the Galapagos. Birds were really inspirational to Darwin. And it is no coincidence, I think, that the foundations of the theory of evolution really were inspired so much by the diversity, the abundance, the resiliency, the beauty of birds today.
Yeah. Birds are very cool animals, very worthy torchbearers of the dinosaur lineage. The book is The Story of Birds by Steve Brusatte. Steve Brasati, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people find this book? Is it just anywhere they get books? Do you have a preferred place?
Well, first of all, David, well, thank you guys for having me on and chatting. And thanks for plugging the book a lot, which I love. Look, support your local bookshops. I tell that to everybody. I love it when I visit a random bookshop somewhere and I see my books on the shelves. It's not always the case, of course, but when I do see that, I think it's so cool. So if you have a local bookshop that you like, support your bookshop. But of course, all the major online mega retailers have the books as well.
I can attest it's at Barnes & Noble because I've seen
right.
it on the shelf myself.
Awesome. That's great. That's fantastic.
I was walking by and went, hey, I know that name.
Yes. Fantastic. We'll put a link in the episode description to one of those retailers where people can get the information about the book.
Sounds great.
Everybody go check it out. Steve, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks again to Steve for joining us. Listeners, if you're interested, we will put a link to Steve's new book down in the episode description. And now it's my turn to talk about news. And I got something better than birds. No offense to our lovely guest, Steve. But I've got news about snakes.
Hey, it's not Snake Month no more.
Specifically, every month is Snake Month. Specifically, a new species. It's 11 months are Snake Month. You get your one.
I'll allow it because we're recording in Snake Month. I'll allow it.
We are recording in Snake Month. This is specifically news about a new, very ancient and very well-preserved fossil snake.
Cool.
This is research published in the journal Nature by Tiago Simoes et al., and we will link in the blog post to an article on Sci News by Enrico de Lazaro. The new snake is named Tametara mirim. It comes from the late Cretaceous of Brazil between about 85 and 75 million years ago. New fossil snake, always very exciting. This fossil snake is extra exciting because, number one, it is one of the oldest known snakes. It is identified here as a stem snake, which means that it is not part of the diversity that we see in modern snakes. It is an earlier branch. It is a stem of the snake family tree, but also because it is astonishingly well preserved. The single skeleton of Tametara includes a very well preserved back half of the skull, with over 100 vertebrae of the body. It is most of a snake, which is way more than you usually get from the fossil record.
That's very exciting.
This makes it not only an excellent look at early snake anatomy, but it is only the fourth articulated, meaning the body is preserved in life position. It is the fourth such snake fossil from the Mesozoic era.
Whoa.
And it is the first from Brazil. There are a couple from Argentina. This is the first one in Brazil. All of the other early snakes from Brazil are single vertebrae. And on top of all that, because the back half of the skull is well preserved, it also has perhaps the best preserved early snake brain case, which means we can learn a whole bunch about how this animal was living. The researchers performed high-resolution CT scans of the skull of the snake, allowing them to examine the shape of the brain case and infer the shape of the different sections of the brain. They were able to look at the shape of the inner ear, identify the location of various cranial nerves, just a whole full cool reconstruction of the inside of this snake's head.
Yeah.
This is really exciting because previous research has found that the shape of the brain case and the various sensory organs in there correlate to lifestyle because they tend to be different depending on what senses the animal is relying on, things like that. So, comparing the shape of the skull to other animals allowed them to make inferences about the lifestyle of Tametara. They found that the brain shape and sensory organs are most similar to modern reptiles like blind snakes, shield-tailed snakes, worm lizards, all of which are specialized digging animals. These are burrowers, these are fossorial animals. The shape of the brain case suggests certain things like reduced eyesight, which we see in other fossorial animals. This is corroborated by the fact that Tametara also has particularly dense skull bones, which is another thing we see in digging animals, especially burrowing reptiles that dig with their face. Those reinforced skull bones are probably really helpful for pushing through the dirt. All in all, not only in the general comparisons, but an actual morphometric statistical comparison strongly supports Tametara as a burrowing snake. They ran the same analysis on another well-preserved Cretaceous stem snake, Deinonychia, which we've talked about before, and the analysis supported that snake as being terrestrial, moving around mostly on the surface. This is important not only because understanding the ecology of ancient animals is very cool, but because this all ties back to the classic snake debate, which we brought up in episode 3 of the podcast. This is not, we haven't stopped wondering this, of what was the habit of the first snakes. Were the earliest snakes digging? Were they swimming? Were they doing something else? The results of this study kind of don't help.
Yeah.
Because they find not only that these two early branching members of the snake lineage are different, one being a digger, one being not, but Tametara isn't just a burrowing snake according to these features. It appears to be a quite specialized burrowing snake.
Yeah.
They make the point in the paper that it has features similar to the most specialized burrowing reptiles today.
Yes. Yeah. You weren't just mentioning like snakes that happen to live in holes. You were mentioning like a bunch of those who never come above ground if they can help it.
Yes. And not only are Tametara and Deinonychia different, the researchers point out they are very different. Like their statistical analysis positions them way far apart from each other. And neither of them matches what other studies have predicted the ancestral snake condition would have been.
Yeah.
So between these 3 different data points of what did early snakes look like, we have 3 radically different answers. And so what we're probably seeing here, and what the authors suggest, is that early snakes diversified very quickly.
Yep.
That they early in their evolution expanded into different lifestyles. They point out there are also the Simileophiids of the Cretaceous, which are aquatic snakes. So from the limited data we have of stem snakes, it looks like there isn't a single line of snakes doing one thing until modern style snakes show up, but that there was just a whole lot of experimentation, transitions between different ecosystems, and the authors make the point that probably this means none of our Cretaceous snakes are a good representative of what the first snakes looked like.
Yeah.
They're all strange because they had already evolved this diversity.
Yeah, we see that a lot with very successful groups, you know, whether modern or in the past, that groups that became, you know, diverse and disparate, you know, spread out very quickly, is that the early history, even when you get like really close to where we estimate some of the earliest members should be, it often is not easy to parse out, because if this group, you know, hit upon a lifestyle, snake shaped or flying or, you know, whatever the thing is, and diversified quickly, shortly after them showing up in the fossil record, you know, a handful of million years, suddenly you have members that are, like you said, extremely specialized, which really throws off the ability to find an easy pattern.
Yeah.
So like their success actually makes it harder in some ways for us to understand their beginnings, because they got successful so quickly.
And the picture that seems to be emerging is that in the Cretaceous, stem snakes were already doing
Yep.
fantastic. Now, scant fossil evidence and phylogenetic analyses all suggest that snakes probably got started in the Jurassic period. So there still is a possibility that someday we will find an even older snake that maybe does represent something closer to what the original ancestors of snakes were doing. But for now, if these results and these authors' argument is to be believed, we're kind of out of luck.
Yep.
And it will remain a mystery for the time being.
It's fossil discoveries like this are very cool. We're like, whoa, we found a really nice snake skeleton with part of the skull that includes a well-preserved brain case, like enough for them to find a lot of detail, not just some crushed, crumbled, broken pottery type bits, but actually a nice example. All of that's pretty much unheard of in your average situation with finding snake fossils. And what it's told us is, awesome. If we could do it again, just a little bit older, then
Well,
that would be right. Oh man, that would be so good if you could just do that.
I love a paper that gets to say the current status of the scientific consensus is that we are confused. And based on the results of this unprecedented detail of a fossil, we were right.
Yep.
We were right to be, we are still confused. We were right to be confused.
And not just that, and we will likely remain to be so.
We will continued confusion into the foreseeable future.
Forecast has.
Turning toward scattered resignation in the morning.
Some westward bafflement. Well, my news is also about a very early member of a group. This is about an early archosaur cousin, an archosaur form from Brazil.
Ooh.
That is from a group and a place that helps fill in some gaps for early archosaur stuff. This is research by Mauricio Garcia. Mauricio Garcia et al. In Scientific Reports. And the article is also by Mauricio Garcia because it is in the conversation. So, archosaur forms is the overall group that includes archosaurs, which is your dinosaurs, your crocs, your pterosaurs, and also their cousins, their archosaur-like animals. These show up and become numerous in the Triassic, and they represented many of the dominant land animals during that time, groups doing the things we'd see dinosaurs do later. This is a new species. This is Silescelida acristata. This is from the Middle Triassic of southern Brazil and dates to about 240 million years old. It is the bones preserved are mostly parts of the limbs. It's relatively small, slender built animal, which a lot of your early archosaurs were these kind of like four-legged predatory dinosaurs. Like they're slim-bodied with long limbs, but often four-legged. And so you get a lot of these early archosaur forms have this interesting look to them.
They're kind of like a first take on a monitor lizard.
Yeah, absolutely. But if they had long limbs instead of squat ones, this one would have been like a moderately sized little animal, not itty bitty, but not sizable, likely predatory. When they ran the phylogenetics to figure out who it's related to, it suggests most likely that it is within a group called Euparchiridae, though they noted that its position is unstable depending on which features and which units, which taxonomic units are considered in the analysis. So maybe it's someone else, but probably it is somewhere within the Euparchirids.
That's also a pretty common situation for early archosaurs and their relatives.
Yeah.
Is a slight tweak to the data tends to shift them between early families.
One of the notable features of this new species is in its femur. It supports that it does have a semi-erect position, so legs more under the body than not, which is very common for your early archosaurs, and similar to what most likely are its close cousins. Being an earlier member, this will be a nice data point for that development of these traits in archosaurs. So it likely will have some good data for future studies into like the locomotion of archosaurs and archosauriforms. Another notable thing is if it is indeed with the euparchurids, that makes this another important data set because until now, fossils for this group are mostly found in Africa, Asia, and Europe. This is one of the first ones, one of the only ones found in South America, and I believe maybe the first one, but I wasn't positive with the way they were wording things. So it expands the geography of this group. It's also the first of the wider group that they're found in, the Eucrocopodans from the Triassic of Brazil. So it is a new location and data point for this overall group, which gives information for like the suggestion of how how these reptiles were spreading out during the Triassic. It also emphasizes that South America's Triassic fossil record might hold some really important fossils if we keep looking there. And then the other note was just that the discovery of this fossil took kind of a circuitous route in that part of the fossil, this specimen was found a while ago, but part of it was lost more than 20 years ago. And the part that was lost was part that preserved the identifiable bits that now let it be known as a new species.
Oh.
And then when those parts were recovered, found to be indeed still in the collection, they were finally able to confirm it was a new species and do this study. And its name actually reflects that. Silescolita is silence leg, and leg, the femur, was the identifiable part, and it was quiet for a very long time.
Yeah. Oh, that's fun.
Yep. And then the A cristata is that the femur doesn't have a crest, which is the identifiable thing. It doesn't have a notable crest that others of its group do have. So a new data point, and hopefully we'll be able to keep looking and find even more information about early archosauriforms in this area.
This news it's a big day for early members of major reptilian groups from Brazil.
The two best groups.
Way to go. The two best groups. We did it. Way to go, Brazil. This is our shout out to all of our South American listeners.
Yeah, you're killing it down there. Keep up the good work.
Doing great work.
And with that, we shall wrap up the news and move on to our main discussion, where we will start by defining what is sexual dimorphism and how many morphs can these sexes have.
More than die.
More than die. So, as usual, to start our discussion, we have to define our terms. Dimorphism, pretty straightforward, means two forms. Dimorph, two conditions of something. Sexual dimorphism is just specifying that those two differences, those two forms, are in the male and female of a species.
Yes.
That there is some distinction between the two sexes of a species. Not all animals show sexual dimorphism. We would call these monomorphic species, where the males and females are more or less indistinguishable from one another.
Yeah, there are a lot of animals that, like, if you're at the zoo, you can't necessarily tell if that's a male or female from your position outside of the enclosure.
Absolutely. And then, of course, any animals that don't have a male-female condition are likely going to be monomorphic. Snails are all hermaphroditic in that they have both male and female sexual organs. So every snail is pretty much the same as every other snail of its species because there is no sexual divide.
Yes. Or when there is morphological differences, they're not sex related.
Exactly.
Like they might be age related, they might be something else.
Well, and like you get the left and right shelled snails. That could be a dimorph. That could be a dimorphism, but it's not sexual.
Yes. There are also species that we've talked about, like the whip-tailed lizards, that are all female.
Yes,
which are also not going to have sexual dimorphism.
So in those cases, you basically can't have sexual dimorphism because by definition, sexual dimorphism is dealing with male and female individuals. Pretty straightforward definition. Now let's muck it up right at the beginning.
Yep.
There has been debate on the semantics of what counts as a difference. A more limited definition would look at sexual dimorphism and say only traits that one sex has that the other does not are gonna count as dimorphic traits. So males have horns, females don't.
Right.
Females have a pouch, males don't. Whatever it is, something that one has that the other lacks. The more inclusive definition is any difference. It could be the absence or presence of something, or the degree of a feature, how big a feature is, how many of something one has.
Right. Or even like body size.
Exactly.
Where it's like there can be overlap, but on average,
yes,
males tend to be this size, females tend to be that size.
This is the more commonly used definition. It's the one we'll be using, if only because it's more fun. But as one paper put it, it is so used here strictly for pragmatic reasons.
Yes, so that the episode can happen.
Yeah, exactly. No, most things you find that discuss it won't use that limited definition. But this does mean that discerning and measuring and categorizing sexual dimorphism becomes much more chaotic with this looser definition, because any difference between the two sexes technically could count as a dimorphism, and some of those you might not think of.
Well, and that looser definition also allows for the potential of overlap.
Yes.
Which kind of counterintuitively means you don't have two morphs, or at least you don't have two distinct morphs, that you have averages on a spectrum, but there isn't actually two separate categories.
Yeah. So while throughout this episode, we will be saying male versus female and female versus male most commonly, because that's how most of the research studies dimorphs, because that's the way to categorize and measure the difference most easily. It is always good to remember, like in our own species, there is actually not a hard line between the two sexes. It blurs in a lot of situations, whether that's due to chromosomal situations or hormonal situations. The two sexes of any given animal group often have exceptions, but generally speaking, you will often see patterns in, and this is one of those cases where we don't often get to say this, most animals. Like, this is more common than it is not common. Species on Earth are often dimorphic in some way. So let's talk about some of the ways they can be different, that we can see dimorphism. This can be any feature on the animal. Physical size, physical traits, structures, coloration, coat pattern, behavior, scent, sound production. Anything can be technically a dimorphism if it's distinct in one sex over the other. The degree of dimorphism is also notable. You have some species that are technically dimorphic, but just slightly. And then others that are so dimorphic, they barely look like the same species.
Yes.
Generally, these are categorized into three groups of trait type. Primary sexual characteristics. Things that relate directly to sexual reproduction. Because sexual dimorphism is very often, not always, but very often tied to reproduction in these animals.
Right. So primary sexual structures would be things like genitals.
The genitalia.
The body parts that are directly involved in the act of reproduction.
Which means any group of animals that have different male and female genitalia are technically at this level sexually dimorphic.
Yes.
Now, this is usually not what something is referring to when they say an animal is sexually dimorphic. What they'll be referring to are what's called secondary sexual characteristics. Features on the body that are not directly related to the act of copulation, but aid in getting to that act, increase their success or access to mates.
Right. This is going to include all of those wacky display features that we often like to talk about. Horns and antlers and colors and feathers and all of those things that mates use to attract each other.
Exactly. And then the third category are non-reproductive, or sometimes called ecological characteristics. Because you get times where the males and females are different, but it doesn't seem to have anything to do with reproduction, but due to how they survive, how they interact with their ecosystem. Of the various kinds of sexual dimorphism we tend to see, the most common, not only in how often you see it, but also in how often it's studied, is going to be sexual size dimorphism,
Yes.
where males and females are different sizes on average, adult sizes. This is extremely common. In many groups, for like mammals, for instance, it's really the only case of sexual dimorphism you're going to see is they look pretty much the same, except one typically weighs more.
Yes. And in mammals, it's almost universally the males.
Exactly. Male biased sexual size dimorphism is what you'll hear that called, is the default in many groups. Mammals, many reptiles, birds, you'll see this a lot. It is often kind of treated as the default, partially because it is so common in mammals, which we'll get into.
Sure.
But there are ones that have the reverse pattern, which you will sometimes hear as reverse sexual dimorphism, which doesn't actually make sense. But
yeah,
you will hear that used.
And reverse sexual dimorphism is one of those where it's like, I get what you're going for. For sure, a man described this.
Yep, in the topsy-turvy world where women are
women,
taller, this is
upside down.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
In many groups, the females are often the larger. Female-biased sexual size dimorphism. Insects, rodents, turtles, snakes, sharks, amphibians, spiders. A lot of those groups, you will find moments of it in like the dominant groups, like mammals. Rodents do tend to have this pattern.
Yeah.
But we do tend to see one version favored over the other per group of animals. That if you are going to be sexually dimorphic, it tends to lean one way for that group.
Yes.
Another extremely common and famous example is color differences, where males and females are different colors. The most famous examples are going to be birds, where the males typically are brighter colored and the females are typically more drably colored and often camouflaged.
Yes. This helps the males put on a showy display for the females, while the females are able to nest without being spotted by predators as easily.
Exactly. Once again, we do see cases where the female is the more brightly colored and uses that to attract males, but this one is pretty commonly the males are the brightly colored, even in cases where they're smaller.
Yes.
Like this is the kind of default for animals on this planet that typically, if you see a brightly colored one, it's often the male.
Yeah, you see that in some mammals too, like certain primates that have those very colorful faces or colorful tuchuses. That often is males putting on a display.
Exactly. It's less common in mammals because we're not as good at making as many colors as other animals.
Yes, or at seeing them.
Exactly. So what you see on mammals is display structures. Boy, we are so good at display structures.
Yeah.
We go crazy with them.
Antlers, horns.
Yeah. Lion manes, even arguably human beards. Like any form of external structure that is unique to one sex is often has the potential to be some kind of display.
What are the face things that orangutans have called?
Oh, the flanges. Yeah.
Yeah, the flange on a male orangutan.
Yes. These are also a very common form of dimorphism and arguably the most famous because it's the peacock tail is where a lot of the discussion, our modern looks at sexual dimorphism got started, with Darwin being oh so frustrated with the peacock tail. One quote I came across during my notes was Darwin writing, "The sight of the feather in a peacock's tail whenever I gaze at it makes me sick," because he could not figure out why they would have it until he came upon this idea of it being sexually beneficial.
Yes. Also, something that I'm sure we'll talk more about, but just to make sure that we're being specific, adult males and adult females, right?
Yes.
A young male lion does not have a mane, and a young male orangutan does not have a flange. Because these are sexually related features, they tend not to show up until sexual maturity.
Yes. Yeah. most of the features we've been discussing so far are ones typically related to gaining access to a mate, being able to fight other competitors, being able to attract attention, being
Mhm.
able to show off or hold a territory so that you have access to mates. This is also going to go for things like sexual dimorphism of behavior, where males and
Mhm.
females behave differently. Males that sing songs to attract females,
Yeah.
mating dances, bowerbirds building their bowers to attract a female. All of
Mhm.
those are not physical structures, but a thing one sex is doing very differently than the other, and that the other does not have instincts to do.
Yes. The first example that came to my mind was elephants, in that
Yes.
as adults, male and female elephants live fundamentally different lives, with the
Hmm.
females hanging out as part of a herd and the males going off and causing trouble on their lonesome. You get these not even just singular behavioral differences, but lifestyle differences.
Exactly. And a lot of these features are often associated with another aspect of their lifestyle, in that typically when we see these kinds of sexual dimorphism characteristics, it also tends to go along with a polygynous lifestyle where a male mates with multiple females, sometimes holding a territory or what you'll often see called a harem, a group of females that
Mhm.
that male is mating with as exclusively as they are able to maintain. That's where this competition, this displaying to try to attract as many females as possible, we tend to see less distinct dimorphism traits in monogamous groups where they aren't having to vie for mates as aggressively. We tend to see fewer of these traits. We also will see these traits present when we see polyandry, where it's a single female and multiple males.
Mhm.
The first idea that
A reverse harem.
oh yes, it's an insane world. The idea that always comes to mind for me first is garter snakes, where the female is
Yes.
much larger than the males, and the males are all vying for that one female's attention and chance to mate.
Yes. There are also birds that do this. There are mammals that do this. It's not
Hmm.
unheard of in these groups.
Exactly. When we get into some other examples of dimorphism, these often are related to other aspects of the animal's lives. Sexual shape dimorphism, where parts of their anatomy are shaped differently, longer limbs, longer
Yeah.
tails, a different shaped skull or jaws. These often are related to ecological traits, ecological adaptations, where the male and female have adapted to live in their ecosystem differently, whether that's in a different part of the ecosystem, in a different type of habitat, or eating different food. These are often not directly related to reproduction.
Hmm.
Some examples would be things like the purple throated carib hummingbird. Male and females have different shaped bills for feeding on different flowers.
Yeah.
The females have a longer and more strongly curved bill to access flowers the males would not be able to access even if they wanted to. And this likely lowers competition between the two and helps them live alongside each other better. Taiwan Japalur lizards show different limb proportions because males tend to perch higher up in the canopy than females, and juveniles who stay lower to the ground.
Yeah.
Even in us humans, with like one of the famous examples is that our hips are sexually dimorphic. Male and female hips are differently shaped, with female hips tending to be wider
Hmm.
because the birth canal has to have room, and males do not have that structural need. So we see a difference there. So that's a reproductive, but not in the act of reproduction, in the act of producing a young.
Yes. The act of production.
Though there are some where it is reproductive. Stingrays, many of them have dimorphic teeth, where females have the molariform crushing teeth, but males go through a cycle where they shed their molar-like teeth and for mating season get sharper teeth, which allows them to bite and latch onto females better during mating.
Yep.
So you can get dimorphism that is not related to getting a mate, but just surviving. There are also other situations that do seem to be there, but are harder to fully understand what's going on. Immunity has been noted to often be divergent.
Yeah.
that immune systems of males and females in many groups of animals tends to show a trend of females having a stronger, more robust immune system, and the males often being, as they put it, the sicker sex, more prone to disease or parasites than the
Yeah.
females.
Which, from an evolutionary perspective, makes sense.
Yes.
Because the female, generally speaking, especially in groups like mammals who give live birth, the female's body is bodying for more than one.
Yes, indeed.
Right? For a portion of the life of that individual, there will be multiple bodies on the line if that individual gets sick, which is not
Indeed.
the case generally for males.
They also made the point that it could be that the cost of investing into the immune systems is different. While females, it is more important for exactly what you just said. For males, it may be worth it to invest a bit less in immune systems to invest in some of those other traits we've mentioned.
Yeah.
It may be worth risking disease if you get to get access to a mate. That may be a cost benefit analysis that tends to lead to males having weaker immune systems. And they pointed out that for females, having a stronger immune system is more important for internal fertilizers, where they have to deal with semen from random males
Yes. This is true.
that may have disease. But this is one of those where this trend has been noted for a very long time. And a study that looked at a bunch of previous studies did find that females do tend to show a stronger immune system. But when they adjusted, including the tree of life in the analysis, they found that it's not actually that significant of a difference when you average it out.
Yeah.
So this is one of those where it does seem there's a difference. How much of a difference is hard to nail down, and whether or not it's as consistent as we thought.
Yeah.
This is a trend that we'll be discussing. Often these traits are hard to actually measure.
Yeah. Well, and this comes back to a topic that we will discuss many times throughout this episode, that again, we tend to be talking about averages when we're
Yes.
talking about these dimorphic traits. You can get, like, there are absolutely examples, even in the extreme cases that feel like it's just a presence or absence thing. You can get an individual that is a male that doesn't have horns, or female that does have horns, because
Yep.
nature's not right. That's not this is, as we said in the introduction, nature doesn't do binaries. So
Yes.
there's always opportunities, even when it comes to the stuff that feels like it would be automatic, like genital structure. Even genital structure, there are in betweens, there are intermediates, there are places where those lines become blurry. So we are almost always, and when we talk about sexual dimorphism, we're talking about a percentage. Sometimes that percentage is like 99%. And
Yeah,
it's yes,
exactly.
99% of the time, this is the difference you're going to see. But a lot of it, like you were just saying with the immunity, it might be a much smaller percent. And the degree of difference might be, there are animals that are sexually dimorphic in size, but the average difference is like a 2% difference. Where it's like, yeah,
Exactly.
technically the males tend to be bigger. If you average all of them together, the average is like 2 extra pounds or something.
Yes.
Right. So we're looking at averages, and that makes the whole thing very hazy in a lot of cases.
Absolutely. And it means that sometimes something that seems like a very clear dimorphism may be more of a gradient than we
Mhm.
first observed. But speaking of the averages and the trends we tend to see, as I mentioned, we tend to see patterns in different groups of life. And these are often aggressively dominant, where like most members of that group show a very similar pattern. Mammals, for instance, over 90% of mammals are polygynous, and most of those show some amount of sexual dimorphism
Mhm.
following the patterns, the examples we've been talking about. Size dimorphism is the most common. It's known in over 4,000 species of mammal, and in 85% of those cases, it is the male that is larger. So it's one of those where, like, yeah, mammals almost ubiquitously follow that males are the larger sex. There are exceptions, rodents, baleen whales, females tend to be
Mhm.
larger, but generally speaking, the male's going to be bigger. And these differences sometimes are very small and sometimes very large. The two most extreme cases of sexual dimorphism in mammals are very fun. The first example is polar bears, where males can be over twice the weight of females, making them the most sexually dimorphic mammal after seals.
Yep. I made a teaser for this episode. We're doing teasers again.
Yes.
And I was like, how do I come up with a teaser for a sexual dimorphism topic? And it's just the skull of an elephant seal.
Yep.
That's what the teaser is. Skull of an elephant
Yeah.
seal, our favorite example.
The southern elephant seal is the most sexually dimorphic in size of any mammal alive today. Females on average weigh between 350 and 900 kilograms. So that's 770 to almost a ton, almost 2,000 pounds, and can measure around 3 meters long. So like 8.5 to almost 10 feet. Adult bulls can range from 3,000 to 3,700 kilograms or 6,600 to 8,200 pounds and can grow from 4.5 to almost 6 meters, so 15 to 20 feet in length, meaning that depending on where you grab one from those ranges, males can be anywhere from 4 to 10 times the mass of the females.
They look like different animals.
Vastly.
Like a polar bear, a big male polar bear still looks like a polar bear.
Yeah, you're shaped the same, you're the same color, you just look like scaled up versions of each other.
A typical female elephant seal looks like a seal, and a typical male elephant seal looks like a monster.
There's a kaiju.
Yeah, they're you would not think that these are the same species.
And then, of course, they also have that trunk and big tusks for fighting. So they are not just sexually dimorphic in size, but boy, are they sexually dimorphic in size.
Yes. Notably, and this might come up again later as well, not all elephant seal males are like that.
Yeah.
The males themselves are dimorphic.
Yes. And this is something this did not come up in a lot of the researches I looked into, but we do see that in a number of groups where you will have a sexual dimorphism of male and females, and then there will be members of the males that have their own dimorphism.
Yes.
This is often referred to the sneaky male pattern.
Yeah. In the case of elephant seals, very famously, you've got your big monster males, and then the other males are not very sexually dimorphic compared to females. They look very similar in their overall body shape. And what they'll do is hang out in the cluster and sneakily mate with the other females.
Yes.
But if another big monster male comes in, then the big male who lives here is going to go fight it.
Yes.
But the ones that don't look like a big monster male can sneak by under the radar. And so you have this male dimorphism that is its own competition. And you see this. Elephant seals are the example we always bring up because it's the most dramatic of those examples. But you see this in other species as well.
Yeah. My favorite example are the giant Australian cuttlefish, where males are massive and they, fight other males and hold, a few females to mate with, but they still have to coax and court the females. And then the smaller males, which are about the same size as the females, not only sneak around and avoid fighting, but will change their patterning to that of the female and will effectively flirt and respond to the courtship of the larger male, but so they can jockey their way in between the big male and the female and mate. There's one video where the big male is over the female and the smaller male is in between them.
Yes.
Actually being the one to get to mate, while the big male thinks they're mating.
So you can get this dimorphism not just of physical shape, but of behavior.
Yes.
This also comes up with those garter snakes you were mentioning, where you'll have male garter snakes who will release female pheromones to trick other males into piling on top of them so that they warm up faster and can go mate.
Yep. It's pretty cool stuff. While we're talking about mammals, I feel like it is worth mentioning us and our primate cousins. Primates as a general rule, are sexually dimorphic.
Mhm.
They're not as extreme as like deers with antlers and elephant seals, but we do tend to see a trend of males usually have a larger body mass,
Mhm.
and in many groups have like bigger canines.
Yes.
You get some extreme examples like silverback gorillas, where the male is massive, has a different skull structure than the females. Mandrills, where males will have like manes and these ridiculous canines.
Yeah. You also have proboscis monkeys,
Yep.
which one of
Yep.
my
Yep.
earliest examples that I remember learning as a kid of a
Yes.
strange sexual dimorphism where the males have a big old nose.
Yep. Sexual dimorphism is very common among primates. It is also present in our own species.
Mhm.
Males do tend to be bigger than females. The ratio is like 1.1 or 1.2. So it's not quite 1 to 1. It's a little bit off.
Yeah.
So it's not extreme, but it is there. We see things like males have beards. They tend to have larger hearts. Females
Mhm.
have wider hips. They tend to also produce and store fat more readily,
Yeah.
which also leads to the fact that females have breasts, prominent breasts, while males typically do not. So we are sexually dimorphic, but we are also the least sexually dimorphic of modern primates for the most part.
Yeah. It's an interesting topic when we turn this subject of sexual dimorphism in the mirror, right? We turn it back on ourselves because we are all humans. And
Yes.
so we are very familiar with these general differences, right? This is sort of ingrained. We can see it pretty readily a lot of the time. These are very
Absolutely.
obvious features to us when we see them. But in the grand scheme of things, we are almost not sexually dimorphic animals.
Yes.
Like another species, like if you asked a crocodile or even like a gorilla, can you identify the males from the females? Probably they wouldn't be able to. Like they would have a harder time than we do with like chimps. Can you spot the male or the female chimps? Humans are really very samey when it comes to comparing these sexually dimorphic traits.
And a lot of these traits are just the result of hormone expression, which is why
Yeah.
things like hormone treatment can be so dramatic because, yeah, a lot of these things are just your body going, hey, the hormones I've got tell me to do this, so that's what I'm going to do. And once that hormone balance changes, the body shifts what it's doing.
And that's where we get to see, and this is a whole other topic that is equally fascinating, of all of the overlaps and the places where we as humans really enjoy putting things in boxes. And so
Yes.
the idea that there are these two distinct male and female body types is very satisfying, but there's so much overlap. And that comment about hormones, I was just talking to a dermatologist earlier today, as of this recording, who was talking about how she sees a lot of older women come in to get their like chin hairs
Yeah. Yep.
removed or something because you get to a certain age and the hormones change, right? That's what perimenopause and menopause is. That's why it happens during puberty, because once the hormones change, everything starts changing.
Yes.
And you can really see those differences, like what the things we ascribe to being differences when the hormones get a little bit wonky, or like you said, if you get hormone treatments for there's a variety of medical conditions that can warrant hormone treatments, and they have a dramatic impact.
Yes.
It's like magic.
Yeah.
Like
Yep.
I've heard from people who are like, yeah, I've been on hormone replacement therapy, and it's like you cast a spell. The way
Yes.
that it changes everything about the body. Yeah, it's just the little chemicals telling the different parts of your body what to do.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Another interesting bit I came across in one paper was noting the fact that as we move along the primate tree toward our lineage, when we get to Australopithecines and Neanderthals and the Homo genus, we see a reduction in sexual dimorphism traits.
Yeah.
Skulls become more similar, canines become less different, size becomes more similar. And one idea that was put forth in that paper was that this could perhaps represent a convergence of male and female roles, that as we started to live more and more like modern humans, what it took to survive as male and females and the way we were living wasn't actually that different. So our physical differences became less and less.
Yeah.
And that, like, yeah, in a village, it doesn't really matter as long as the jobs get done.
Yeah, or
Who's
even
doing the
before
jobs?
that,
Yeah.
we see that in a lot of groups today. Like you were saying, the less dramatic sexual dimorphism often correlates with male and female roles being very similar.
Exactly.
Where like an elephant seal, what the male is doing is radically different, just lifestyle wise. But that's less true with something like the example that came to my mind earlier was albatrosses.
Yes,
Because they were a group that, or penguins. Penguins are another great example. These pair bond ideally for life, right? Unless something gets in the way. And they're kind of doing the same thing for the most part.
Yes.
So you tend to get much less of that sexual dimorphism. And then this is also another place where anytime we bring up humans, it's always valuable to point out that modern humans, there's so many of us. There's so many of us that any line that could possibly be blurred is blurred.
Yep.
But always a handy reminder that we are not subject to the same evolutionary pressures as we see in other species, even in our ancestors, because of how all-encompassing our cultural and societal trends have become. And I point that out only because, especially when you start getting into this talk of like the roles of males and females, you get this mindset of evolutionary predeterminism, which, while a useful framework to understand the evolution of life broadly speaking, is not terribly helpful when you try to apply it to humans, and more often than not is harmful when you try to restrict roles like that based on, the hormones or the genetics that your body happens to have.
Yeah, absolutely. This kind of argument has been used to enforce sexual discrimination in human cultures, going back about as far as we have evidence of people discussing sexual dimorphism.
Yes.
Quotes in writings from Aristotle in the 4th century BC describes noting that there is a difference between males and females, and that females are weaker, less muscular, thinner limbs, delicate feet, higher pitched voices, and really used it as a way to reassert the dominance of men over women, that males are the stronger, superior, and females are less in every metric. This has been used for a long time as a way to try to explain why it makes sense that one sex is typically in charge.
Yes. I made the joke before about the phrase reverse sexual dimorphism must have been coined by a man, which I made as like a haha funny, that's a funny little joke. But also, it almost certainly was, because that is the ingrained mindset that we fall into. That is a way of framing this topic to reinforce this cultural status.
Yes. Well, and treating it casually as the default, as this is normal. When men are big and strong, that's normal. When males are big and strong, that's normal. Everything else is a divergence, a path away from the norm.
Yes.
I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just using words.
I'm just pointing it out.
Like normal and backwards. That's all I.
And this is why we like hyenas so much.
Yep. Another fun example in that kind of category is, speaking of birds, the birds that are monogamous and share parental care, we tend to see less sexual dimorphism. Most birds are not that model, and when you get the birds of paradise and peacocks and all sorts of those where the males are displaying for females and blah, blah, blah. There are some where it's flipped and the females are larger. One of the most common is raptors, which are monogamous typically,
Yeah.
So both are caring for the young, but they're caring for them in different ways, and that may be why they're dimorphic.
Hmm.
Females do tend to do the largest amount of defending the nest, where being bigger is likely helpful to guard that territory, while males are often doing more of the hunting, where being smaller to be more maneuverable may be more beneficial. So it could be here that the difference isn't due to competition, but due to the roles of parenthood that each sex
Yeah.
is taking on. You get some groups where the trends are not as like reptiles. Some reptiles, males tend to be larger. Lizards and crocs, males often are larger. But then snakes and turtles, females are often larger. But then there's exceptions within those groups. There's lizards where the females are larger, and there's snakes, vipers, and tortoises where the males tend to be larger. So reptiles are doing a wider variety of patterns than a lot of the other groups, but both in the extremes where in both cases you can get males that are half again as heavy as females and females that are half again as heavy as the males.
Yeah. I think we talked about this in the Boas and Pythons episode 196, where there was a famous, I think it was a Burmese python that was at some zoo. I think his name was Colossus. And he was hailed as like, oh, this is the biggest python. And there was a study that looked at the remains of this snake much later and concluded that not as big as previously reported, but also at this size, almost certainly a female.
Yep.
But the marketing was look how big he is, this giant colossus, because we are humans and we have this very mammal centric perspective where, and I'll notice myself do this when I see an animal and it's a big one. I go, oh no, he's real big, just because it's that mammal default that's stuck in your brain.
Exactly. I love using it to note creature features because, you know, animal movies, it's always a giant version, which means it's very easy to go, well, Jaws was definitely a female.
Yeah.
The Croc in Lake Placid, definitely a male. Anaconda, definitely a female. Like, easy peasy, because there's no way there's at that size.
Yes.
Like, when you see a big female great white versus a big male, it's shocking.
Yeah.
They're so much bigger.
Yeah, that capital B big.
And then same with like crocs, where male crocs are often called bull crocs because a full same aged full grown male and female can be almost twice the size of the female. Like the males can be so monstrously big that it brings up the question of how are you even able to coordinate when the time comes. Last two groups to mention, which also have some of my favorite examples. In fish, we do tend to see that females are often larger, though there are males that are larger. And in some of those situations, you get a case where the male maintains a harem, but also reduces the chances for those females to grow larger. And when that male dies, often one of those females will then become the dominant female and turn into the new male.
Yes, which is something that there are other vertebrate animals that do that. Like there are frogs that do something similar, but fish are really famous for like there needs to be one male.
Yeah. Yep.
And it like the Gerudo, there must be one of them. And if that male dies, we can't wait.
Well, because every now and then a little kid with a sword comes and kills your male.
Comes up and takes it out, and now one of the females of the fish, yeah, you're the big one.
Yep.
You're the male now. Look at me. Yes. I am the male now. And now hormonally, anatomically, they will fully transform into the opposite sex.
Which is so extreme, and it would be one of the most extreme fish examples if anglerfish didn't exist.
Yeah. Talk about sexes that seem like wildly different species.
Yep. Not in all species, but in many species of deep sea anglerfish, males and females, extremely different size. Females can often be several orders of magnitude larger than the males. So not just 2 or 3 times, orders of magnitude.
Yes.
Literally speaking here. The males in a number of these species will seek out the female, and when they do, bite onto the female and then release enzymes that dissolve the tissue of the female's skin so that the male's mouth can fuse and become one with the female's body, where they share nutrients and blood flow, and all of the male's organs dissolve until all that's left are the male's testes. And now the female just has a pair of testes and can often, over the female's lifetime, gather many pairs of testes that the female could just draw from when it's time to produce young and fertilize their eggs.
Yeah, the male becomes an organ on the female's body, and then the female kind of becomes, in biological terms, the phrase hermaphroditic refers to, like you mentioned with snails, an individual that has both male and female reproductive organs. And that basically becomes the condition for the adult female, except that the male organs used to be a fish.
Yep. Yep. It's an extreme level of sexual dimorphism, and once again, would be probably the most if it weren't for cephalopods, which get even more intense. Invertebrates, generally the females are larger. This is true among insects and arthropods and even most of your worms and stuff. Mollusks, it's less common, but in cephalopods, females do tend to be larger. Usually it's not a ridiculous size difference.
Sure. And this is often also ascribed to the females need to hold on to eggs.
Exactly. Yes.
This is a common explanation for the same as with snakes and stuff, is that the female needs to have a whole clutch, litter, whatever species you are, and produce all of those eggs inside the body, and it helps for the body to be bigger.
Exactly. And this will come up as we go on in the episode, but we call this increased fecundity, success in reproduction. That a larger body means more space or resources for producing and caring for young. In cephalopods, there are two notable examples where the female is larger. A paper nautilus, which is cousins of octopus. Females create this shell-like structure that they float around in and can grow up to 10 centimeters long, with the shell being about 30 centimeters. And the males typically don't get bigger than 2 centimeters. And the males also only mate once and then die, while the females can mate multiple times. So they also live way longer than the males.
Yeah.
But the record holder for size sexual dimorphism of modern animals is the blanket octopus, where females, they have this long webbing, which is the blanket between their arms. They can reach 2 meters, so 6.5 feet long. Males are typically 2.5 centimeters or an inch, which means their weight ratio is at least 10,000 to 1. Wow. And can get as high, probably at least, as 40,000 to 1.
That's like if you as a person are whatever size you are.
Yep.
And then your mate can fit in that, not like your main pants pocket, but like that little one that no one uses, that you can't fit anything in there. That one.
Like, that means my mate would be a little bit bigger than my thumbnail.
Yep. That's, once again, that is an entirely different type of animal.
Yep. Yeah. Insane. And then finally, to mention it, because this has been very animal heavy, we do see sexual dimorphism in plants, just not nearly as common.
Sure. Plants also don't do sexes the same way that we do. Actually, the very first episode of the first season of Leave It to Us was about sex-changing trees. And Allie goes into a bunch of the details of like why tree sex is weird from an animal perspective.
Yeah. Generally, to relate it to the words we've been using, 90% of flowering plants are hermaphroditic, where the flowers have both male and female parts. Every tree is the same sex as every other tree of that species. In that 10%, you can get a sex dichotomy with quote unquote male and female trees.
I believe in botany terms that is called monoecious.
Yes,
when
exactly.
there isn't a physical separation between the sexes. And then the other one, the more, reasonable, normal seeming ones to us are dioecious, where there is
Yes.
what appears to be a male and a female.
And that's only like 6 to 7% of flowering plants.
Yeah, they don't do it a lot.
And their differences are mostly in the flower structure and how often they flower and things like that. There are vegetative differences, so physical differences of the plant, but in most cases, without them being flowering, you won't be able to tell a male from a female until they
Mhm.
flower. So it is there, but much less common, much less dramatic on
Yes.
average than we see in animals.
And speaking of other kingdoms, there are also our fungi, which don't worry about it.
Yep. They do not need to lower themselves to our simplistic understanding
To our puny human brains.
of reproduction.
Fungi have like hundreds of sexes.
Yeah.
It's just completely. This conversation is more or less fully irrelevant
Yes.
to fungi, also to microbes like bacteria
Yep.
and stuff. I think there are technically similar situations in a bunch of these other organisms, but sexual dimorphism is really an animal feature because separate sexes is really an animal feature.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Just a couple other examples that I want to mention because we did. Listeners, let us know your favorite examples that we didn't mention
Please.
because there's a bajillion of these. When we were talking about lifestyle differences, we didn't mention eusocial insects,
Yep.
but episode 111 for eusociality, go listen to how that works. But where like you not only have dimorphism in body shape and everything between, say, a female bee and a male bee in a hive, but you also have dimorphism between the females because you've got a queen and then you've got the workers, but then also the workers have different. So you've got lots of morphism and some of it is sexual and some of it is not.
Well, it's, some of my favorite examples are like there's some ants where you see the queen and the workers and you're like, all right, that's pretty extreme. And it's like, well, the males are also different. It's like, how different can they be? And then you see and it's like, oh, you are just a body that produces sperm. Like you do that and then you die. You are barely a functioning insect.
It is really interesting the number of cases there are where sexual dimorphism has reduced the male of the species to basically just being a sperm producing organ.
Yep. Yeah.
And again, basically shifting towards that no separation of the sexes scenario that we see in snails and such, where each individual has multiple reproductive organs, can mate with whomever, an adult of the same species, because they also have both types of reproductive organs. There are species like the anglerfish where it's that you're that's sort of the end result is you've just become an individual with both, and you don't need the copulatory behavior.
Yeah, it's sexual dimorphism is one of the most famous examples in evolution of runaway processes that can eventually lead to truly insane extremes of biology.
Yep. Anglerfish and elephant seals. Listeners, go listen to episode 104 about pinnipeds and episode 109 about hyenas and episode 140, horns and antlers. We've talked about this a lot.
Yes. Well, it's, as we said, most animals are sexually dimorphic. It's not like 90%, but more than half of animals alive today show some amount of sexual dimorphism. Odds are, if you're talking about an animal group, there's going to be sexual dimorphism evolved.
Yeah.
And next, we'll talk about how these extreme traits evolve. What is the evolutionary process that leads to this runaway situations of just truly insane differences after the break? So stay tuned for that. Scientists have been curious about why we see these differences in males and females for forever. Already mentioned Aristotle, who looked at this condition and did give a proposed explanation for why there were differences between males and females.
I bet he nailed it.
You wait. He believed that it was due to the temperature of semen that was received would lead to male traits and female traits. Hot semen leading to males, cold semen leading to females.
That is fascinating
Mm-hmm.
because there are animals
Yeah.
whose sex is temperature dependent. Like
Not
turtles,
as dumb as it sounds first off.
Yeah, like I don't know of any example where it's related to the temperature
No.
of the semen, but the nest, right? Turtles are a famous
Yes.
example where the temperature of the nest will determine the ratio of males to females, as opposed to the chromosomal determination that we see in mammals, in ourselves, where
Exactly.
the chromosomes are going to dictate what hormones are happening. So that's not that far out. I mean, it's far out, but it's not as
Yeah.
far out as I expected it to be.
Well, it's especially one of those ones where it's like, that's not ridiculous. But knowing that you took no measurements to come to that conclusion lets me
Yes.
feel much more confident in calling you ridiculous.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's ridiculous. It's just not quite as ridiculous as I expected.
We didn't really get a modern view of what the actual mechanism was until Darwin.
Yeah.
In Origin of the Species and in Darwin's writings, one of the big questions was, why do we see these extreme traits? And specifically, why do we see traits that are obviously bad for the animal? You know, the peacock tail,
Mhm.
bright colors, being very noisy are not good for animals trying to avoid predators and to survive, and came to the conclusion of sexual selection, that
Mhm.
one mate selecting for features of the other sex leads to the exaggeration of these features. And sexual selection has been since then the cornerstone of our understanding of sexual dimorphism. We did an entire episode on it already,
Episode 63.
so you can go back to that for a fuller discussion. But for anyone who just needs a refresher, this is the idea that typically in us mammals and in many animals, females are the choosy sex,
Mhm.
selecting which males they want to mate with based off of criteria. And these criteria are often different ways to infer that the male is more healthy, has better genetics for survival, has more ideal traits that will be transferred to their offspring. And they select those males, sexually selected.
Mhm.
Those traits then get passed on. And as females continue to choose big antlers, bright colors, loud song, crazy dance, those features become more and more prominent and therefore ridiculous, where you get peacock tails and birds of paradise and bowerbirds doing things that seem way over the top, but because it is after millions of years of selecting for that specifically every time.
Yeah. And as always, it's important to point out that the individuals aren't looking at the mate options and going, that one has better genetics, that one is a better
Yes.
survivor. What's happening is that the sight of antlers is having a response for one, neural pathway, chemical reaction, whatever is transmitting those responses. The sight of antlers, and a individual that is getting more food and is living more safely is going to be able to grow bigger antlers.
Yes.
So the ones that mate with the ones that have big antlers are more likely to have offspring that will also end up being healthy, not related to the antlers, but the other traits that individual had. But then it also means that if you have big antlers, you get to mate. And so your offspring are also going to inherit those big antlers.
Yes.
So these traits are going along. I remember there was a study where they did it with spiders, where in many species of spiders, the hairs on the body are a sexually important trait. That females will
Yes.
go for the hairier males of that species. And they did some study with a species that wasn't very hairy, where they took an image of one of the males and then photoshopped extra hairs on it, and the females went nuts for it.
Yeah.
Like
Yep.
full, and it was just, yeah, something about those hair, just that visual stimulus is triggering this response. And so it becomes coupled with these other beneficial survival traits.
Yes.
So that eventually what happens is, yeah, if you have more hairs or big antlers, you're more likely to mate and produce offspring. And that's a runaway snowball for evolution. And that's how you get preposterously large antlers or preposterously hairy spiders or whatever the feature is.
Absolutely. A lot of times you'll hear these kinds of traits called fitness indicators, that
Mhm.
something about it is an indicator of how healthy, fit, or successful that male is, because they're only able to have these big antlers because they're doing so well, or survive with these big feathers because they are capable enough, or make this big sound because I am big and strong enough. That
Mhm.
it is a way to indicate the superiority of that individual male in one way or another. Some fun examples I found, which I had not heard. Lion's mane's big famous example. Males have
Mhm.
big mane, females do not. Mane is a big showing structure, but also the dark color is associated with dominance, because in the hot savanna, a darker mane is going to be a detriment, is going to make that male more likely to overheat, and darker colored manes are associated with more dominant and successful males. And on the flip side, the Himalayan tahr, which is a goat-like animal, I don't actually know who they're most closely related to, but they live up in the mountains in cold weather, and lighter colored manes indicate more dominant males in them, because you won't soak up as much sun and heat up.
Yeah. And this is really why Darwin was so flummoxed by this,
Yes.
because it is counterintuitive. Because the whole idea is you can only have this trait if you are doing so well at surviving
Yes.
otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And so that trait becomes this corollary with whatever those other genetic traits are that are allowing that survival.
Yes. And it's why it can lead to such extreme versions of this, because not only does the selection for them cause the trait to show up, but it also selects for females who like that trait.
Yes.
And so the females' drive to mate with males who have that trait also goes up. So it just is a feedback loop and goes off. But though sexual selection is the dominant mechanism in the evolution of sexual dimorphism, it is not enough to explain the vast diversity that we see. There are other mechanisms and hypotheses for how it can evolve. One of those is ecological mechanisms, like we talked about in different shaped bodies for surviving in different habitats. It's thought that in environments that are resource poor or have lower species numbers, competition can start to happen between males and females instead of between that species and other species.
Right. You're
for
competing
resources,
for food and
space.
stuff.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. And that this could lead to, like we see in other groups, niche partitioning. That if you and I are both herbivores and we're trying to eat the same plants, we're gonna get into fights. So if I can reach a little bit above you and go for the top of the bush, and you can go down and eat the bottom or the grass, we won't compete. We can eat side by side. Everything's good. We
Mhm.
can see the same patterns happen in males and females. This can lead to the bill specialization of the hummingbird. We also see it in if they're occupying different parts of the environment. In Electus parrots, females are bright red and males are green because the males forage at the top of the canopy, where they're more vulnerable to predators, so they need to be camouflaged.
Oh.
So this can also lead to sexual dimorphism, which may not increase reproductive success. This is not necessarily going to make you more attractive to the other mate, but it does increase survival,
Yes.
which inevitably increases reproductive success because you have to do one to get to the other. If you don't survive, you
Yes.
don't get to reproduce. That's how
Yes.
it works.
And also, healthy parents have healthy offspring.
Yes, exactly.
And like if you're competing for food, one of the downsides of that is that the parent that's producing eggs or offspring isn't getting enough food.
Yes.
And that's going to have effects down that reproductive cascade.
Yeah. So like when we see ecologically dimorphic species, we don't tend to see more success in more dimorphic groups, but we do see less competition between the males and the females in the more dimorphic groups. Another way you can get dimorphism is as reproductive roles change. We mentioned this with the predatory birds, the raptors, but we see this in many cases that the amount of investment or the way they are investing into reproduction is different between males and females. Therefore, differences can arise. This is often described by a principle called Bateman's principle, which describes the pattern that typically for males, mating is a less costly endeavor because it is cheaper to produce millions of sperm than it is for females to produce a relatively small number of eggs in comparison. So invariably, that difference in investment and cost will lead to a difference in behavior during reproduction, in approach and strategies to reproduce, and what's important to either sex in choosing or selecting a mate. This is not a 100% pattern, and it has had people who have found evidence against it, but it is one that you'll see come up, that different in investment can lead to divergence. And when we see situations where only one sex is mainly taking care of the young, that can lead to divergence. One example that I saw was in many bats, females are larger because females have to carry the embryos and transport the young after. So just being bigger is going to be helpful for just carrying babies, literally inside and outside.
Yeah.
That is going to lead to bigger females.
You got to be bigger and stronger because you got to carry a whole other bat around all the time.
Yeah. And if the males aren't aiding in that at times, then the males have no reason to increase their size evolutionarily. So that different selective pressures can cause divergence. These different pressures that can cause sexual dimorphism, as always, are not separate. They're not isolated from each other. Genetic models have shown that all three make sense and should be able to cause sexual dimorphism to occur, and all three can occur simultaneously.
Yeah.
So there is no distinction. In most cases, most studies do still consider that sexual selection will be either the triggering event for sexual dimorphism to first come about, or the way it is maintained. That once a divergence shows up, a dimorphism shows up, then selection for that, sexual selection for that, keeps it going in the species. But all three are possible, all three can happen. Another neat pattern that shows up in the evolution of sexual dimorphism is in size dimorphism. We often see a pattern that gets described as Wrench's rule, which is that the degree of size dimorphism, so how different the sizes are of the sexes, changes with body size. That as you go up to bigger species and down to smaller species, the degree of difference changes, but it changes differently depending on which sex is the bigger sex.
Oh, interesting.
In groups where the males are the bigger sex, as you get bigger, the size difference gets bigger. So small animals with bigger males are only a little bit bigger than the females. Big animals like crocs or or bears, where the male is bigger, the male's way bigger.
Interesting.
On the flip side, if the female's bigger, at smaller sizes, the female's way bigger than the male.
Anglerfish or spiders.
Yes.
Yeah, this is another thing we didn't talk about, but this came up in episode 188 about cannibalism. where you also get dietary differences that are dimorphic. Dietary dimorphism.
In that one sex is cannibalistic and the other isn't.
Yeah. The female sex includes males. And in those cases, often the female is bigger. That's why that sexual cannibalism is able to happen, because the female spider is so much bigger than the male spider that they could just grab it.
Exactly. But as you go up to bigger animals, the females become less notably large. Like baleen whales, the largest animals on the planet, females are typically larger, but only by 5%.
Yeah.
So they are bigger, but not anything you'd notice looking at a blue whale.
Right. The difference between being 95 feet long and 100 feet long is...
Yep.
When you're 6 feet long, you don't notice that difference.
You're a whole one of me shorter.
Yes.
There have been many explanations given for why we might see this pattern. Many of them are the ones we've discussed of, selection for larger females and higher fecundity of reproductive success could be a leading thing. This would lead to that negative allometry when we pattern it out, that it's more beneficial at smaller sizes than at larger sizes. Mm-hmm. Though the fecundity relationship between female size and success rate isn't as stable. Like there has been evidence or situations where we thought that was the case, and it turns out that's not what's happening, that there isn't actually a correlation. So whether or not that is regularly why females are bigger in species doesn't seem to be as clear as it's often said to be.
Yeah, including on this podcast. Because
yes.
I know I've said it several times.
Yeah, because I thought it going into this.
Yep.
I had always heard, and I thought it, and then going through the notes, I found things are like, actually, there's been a number of studies where the females are larger or have larger, womb areas, larger reproductive spaces.
Sure. Just the body shape.
Yeah, the proportions. But then when we actually looked at the anatomy, it turns out that size difference is related to something else, not reproduction. So definitely can be the case, because it has been found to be consistent in some groups, but may not be the case.
Interesting.
And then selection for either sexual selection for large males or male competition, that the bigger male wins more fights, selects for bigger males.
Yes.
And now you have to get it even bigger because the males got bigger.
Yes. And now you're twice the size of the females.
Yeah.
And things have gotten out of control.
You bring a knife, I bring a gun, and it escalates from there. So we see a lot of interesting patterns in sexual dimorphism that show up, and it can be driven by a number of selective pressures. Some of them natural selection for survival, some of them sexual selection, and then others could have to do with features that are less clear and more random, just genetic differences that happen to show up in a group and then become solidified because of how they react when the different sexes are expressed in the species.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about that earlier when we were talking about the differences in humans. One of the things that we notice a lot is susceptibility to certain diseases and such.
Yes.
And for the most part, that tends to be just a side effect of how hormones and other molecules are behaving in the body, which is just a side effect of the genetic structure that is determining which hormones are being produced. Where it's like, that's kind of just a side effect of those differences. I know there's also been studies about like traits that just happen to be carried on the X or Y chromosome.
Exactly.
Where it's like, this isn't necessarily related to sexual behavior or to different roles or anything, but one way or another, this feature got glommed on to the X chromosome or the Y chromosome. So you only have that feature if you have that chromosome. And it's just a side effect. It's just a hitchhiker.
Yep. So dimorphism can happen directionally, as we say, where it is being evolved. Evolution is happening due to the pressures and success it yields, sexual reproduction or survival. But it also can just happen because your genes are different now. And that means differences are going to happen. because when two things aren't the same, they're different.
That's true. Listen, listeners, you heard it here first. Common Descent podcast. When two things aren't the same, they're different.
That's what I want on my button when I run for office.
We'll do that. That's very funny because I was just going to say that's some real presidential talk you got going on there.
Right?
We'll put it on a ribbon for Dragon Con next year.
Yeah.
That's going to be your new, you're going to have to update your Discord profile.
Yes.
Red hair, Crocs. When two things aren't the same, they're different.
Makes me think of a post I saw years ago, which is just said, everything in the universe either is or isn't a potato.
And you know what?
Yeah.
Where's the lie?
And then had a little drawing of a guy just with his arms grumpily crossed, and then he goes, I guess.
Although, as we have said, nature doesn't do binaries. And so next time we bring Allie on, we'll have her tell us about all the blurry lines between what is and isn't a potato. We'll start with sweet potatoes.
So as we are discussing studying sexual dimorphism, let us come to the section we always come to. How do we do that for the fossil record?
Oh.
Can we identify sexual dimorphism in fossils? Which is an excellent question that we are going to discuss for the rest of this episode, because I do not hazard to answer it.
I was going to say, you didn't say answer. You didn't promise that we're going to answer it.
Listen, my lawyers told me.
Not legally. The law requires that I answer no.
This is an extremely complicated and muddy topic.
Mm-hmm.
Were fossil animals sexually dimorphic? Almost certainly, because most animals today are. It would be utterly ridiculous to consider that sexual dimorphism only showed up in the last few million years.
Right.
That makes no sense. Can we confirm that they were sexually dimorphic? Depends on who you ask in lots of situations. There are numerous accounts of sexual dimorphism being described in fossil groups, and numerous accounts of those descriptions being overturned by other studies.
Yes.
So first off, how would we go about? We need to try to, what tools are we going to use to identify sexual dimorphism in the fossils? We need to identify, are there two morphs?
Mm-hmm.
Do we have dimorphs? You can often start, and many studies will touch on this, by looking at related taxa. Do we see sexual dimorphism regularly in the group of life, or the closely related groups of life today? That means we could expect it or suspect it in this fossil group. In dinosaurs, sexual dimorphism is common in both birds and crocs, their two closest relatives. Ergo, it makes sense that it might have been common in dinosaurs.
Yes.
Useful for predicting or supporting the interpretation of sexual dimorphism, but does not actually identify it. It only can speculate. So to actually identify it, you have to look at the bones and find two morphs within the fossil record of that species.
Yes.
There are two main tools we use to do this: morphometrics and histology. Morphometrics is the go-to. This is looking at the shape of a thing, in this case, bones typically, and digitizing it in one way or another by taking the shape of that and either doing measurements or laying down points in the computer or doing a silhouette and comparing. You then run all this data through statistical analysis to compare how similar or different are the shapes of the bones you're looking at.
Yes. What you're hoping to find is that your bones cluster around two averages.
Exactly.
Like, yes, these 50 or so percent tend to be this size, and this 50 or so percent tend to be this size. And if you graph it, you get two humps.
Exactly.
Which we call a bimodal distribution. Because, math fans, there are two modes.
Yes. So if we find that, that is evidence that there were two morphs. Now, that only identifies dimorphism.
Yes.
We now have to confirm that one of those clusters is a bunch of males and the other cluster is a bunch of females.
Yes. Also, even before we get to that step, I do want to make the point that what we're looking for is a statistical pattern,
Yes.
which by its very nature requires a large sample size, which
Yeah.
instantly rules out most fossil species.
Yep.
That
Yep.
if there's only 5 of this species known from the fossil record, that's probably not going to be, unless they're radically different.
Yeah.
That's not enough to identify dimorphism. You do need a good sample size. So
Yes.
in the example of dinosaurs, like Will was just mentioning, almost all dinosaurs are ineligible for this type of analysis.
Yep. They may have been sexually dimorphic, but we can't detect it with
Mhm.
how few we have. But even in the cases where we do have enough to have a statistically significant pattern, until we can determine that they are different sexes, let alone figuring out which one's which, that they
Yeah.
are male and female, we haven't identified sexual dimorphism yet, just two morphs. Histology is where we often go to try to identify the biological differences of those two groups. Histology is the practice of cutting a thin slice out of a bone and then grinding it down until it is thin enough to let light through, and you can get a really detailed examination of the internal structure of the bone. This is where we can get things like growth rates by looking at the pattern of growth inside the bone, maturity, signs that this is a full grown individual or a young individual, micro bone structures. Is the bone built differently? Huge amounts of data from histology, and it works well with smaller sample sizes. So it can be more discerning with less material. This can sometimes help to determine if there is a sexual difference between the two groups. Not always, because not all groups have evidence inside the bone that is going to indicate sex, or we may not know what will indicate that in this group yet. There might be something there. We just don't know that that's what that pattern is telling us. But in some cases, you can get indicators that are very clear. The famous example being the discovery of medullary bone in T. rex. Medullary bone is a buildup of bone that we see in birds today, where female skeletons deposit extra bone to store calcium for producing eggs. This is only seen in females, not males. So a T-Rex with medullary bone suggests that this is a female T-Rex doing a similar process. This is a way to definitively determine that that individual is a female. But this will only work on individuals with medullary bone, and female birds do not perpetually grow medullary bone. They only grow it for the reproduction cycle. So a T-Rex without medullary bone is either a male or a non-reproducing female.
Yes.
So ideally, we would find other more consistent patterns like bone compactness, which is the density of bone. We see that in things like Nile monitors. Females and males have different density of bones, whereas density tends to increase in males and decrease in females as they grow. So finding other patterns, this is how we can now determine that the dimorphisms we found are actually sexually related.
Yes. So we need a good enough sample size for that statistical difference, and we need enough of that rare evidence that tells us one sex or the other to tell us one sex or the other.
Yep. And a museum that's willing for us to chop up one of their fossils, because that's the downside of histology. It is destructive. Morphometrics, it's nice because you're just taking photos of the bones typically.
Which isn't destructive as long as you're careful.
Yeah, as long as you're doing it right, yes. So ultimately, a combination of these techniques is how we would go about determining sexual dimorphism. As one paper put it, it's often not a question of choosing the best method, but choosing the method that can actually be employed with the samples available.
Yeah.
So, like, you're doing the best you can with what you got. All that being said, there are so many complications.
Yeah.
It's honestly very discouraging.
Yeah, I think basically every example I've ever heard of a study putting forth evidence for sexual dimorphism in a fossil species has been, if not disproven, strongly debated.
Yep.
Because it's so difficult to do.
Well, and often what happens, and we'll get into this with some specific examples, but is that the pattern that was established in one study is not consistently noted in future studies.
Yes.
So it's not necessarily that we found a contradicting pattern, but we did not find the pattern you said you found. So maybe it was something about the sample you used or something about your study, because
Yes.
we're not seeing what you're saying. The issues for studies like this are going to typically fall into some major categories. One that we've already touched on is sample size.
Mhm.
For morphometrics, it needs to be statistical. You need enough data points to be statistically significant. If it's too small of a sample, you can't guarantee that this represents the larger population. It may just be this little group. And this has been a big issue with a lot of sexual dimorphism studies. There have been studies that have used as few as 10 individuals, and it was great because I found one paper that said some have relied on a sample size of just 2, and then I found the paper that said, here's an example of two primates that have different sized canines. And this is another thing that comes up with sexual dimorphism studies. Sometimes when sexual dimorphism is said to be noted in a study, they then go on to make a number of inferences from that about behavior and lifestyle and reproductive style. In this case, it was 2 primate skulls from the Eocene, North Arctic, 2 partial skulls, different sized canines. They interpret this as signs of sexual dimorphism in primates, one of the earliest bits of evidence, and that therefore likely lived a polygynous social groups like we see in sexually dimorphic primates today.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just from 2 partial fossils, which that could be a bunch of reasons those are different. One could be malnourished, one could be older, one could be there's a lot of reasons we could find differences.
Yeah. If you don't have a good sample, what you need instead is multiple lines of evidence.
Yes.
So, for example, there was a study that came out about a decade ago that actually our friend Ethan published from episode 7 on the gray fossil site red pandas, because there are 2 well-known skulls of the red pandas, one of which is larger and bulkier but physically younger. It is a young adult individual, and the other is an older individual that is significantly smaller and slenderer, which is a pattern we see in similar animals today, where males get bigger and females get smaller. So this is a fairly convincing example that this could very easily be explained by this is a young male, this is an old female.
Absolutely.
That's still just a sample size of 2.
Yep.
It's 2 pretty well preserved skulls, and it's supported by comparison with their close relatives today. And it's only 5 million years ago, so we wouldn't expect a whole dramatic bunch of difference. But the fact does remain that red pandas today are not strongly sexually dimorphic.
Yeah.
So this does rely on this species being different from how they are today. So even in that case, that is that's a very convincing case. That's a really cool example. That's still just 2 members of a species that we know very, very little about. That could be wrong, and it wouldn't take much for that to be wrong.
Exactly, because there's no way to rule out that this wasn't just a particularly fast-growing individual. This happens where, why are you 8 feet tall? My genetics work real good at making me 8 feet. Every now and then, someone gets real big, and the other individual could be smaller for some reason that caused them to be shaped differently. We very often in these studies, sexual dimorphism is a very reasonable answer, but it is often very difficult to rule out the other possible answers.
Yes.
And therefore, concluding sexual dimorphism may be a bit much. This was discussed in one paper that listed the fact that another issue is methodology, that many studies that go looking for sexual dimorphism are already prepared to interpret it. And so as soon as they see evidence for it, conclude sexual dimorphism without testing for sexual dimorphism and without testing against other potential answers.
Yeah. And it's so easy to do that because sexual dimorphism is almost a guarantee that
Yes.
it was occurring.
Yes.
But confirming that that's what you've spotted is very difficult.
Yeah. Well, and one example they gave that is a good lesson in this regard is if you take a selection from a population that is not sexually dimorphic, is
Mhm.
monomorphic, but if you get samples from the two extreme ends of that population, you could still end up with a dimorphic pattern. You could
Yeah.
still end up with a bimodal pattern because the tallest members and the shortest members of that group are going to look like two different morphs if you don't have the middle.
Well, you could do this here in North America.
Mm-hmm.
If you looked at, say, squirrels or
Yes.
any mammals, really, but your two populations were one from Canada and one from Florida,
Yep.
you're probably going to see size dimorphism because the northern population will be bigger than the smaller population. That's a trend that we tend to see, and it won't have anything to do with sex.
Yes. Another big issue is control of the specimens. There's a lot that can happen to cause differences among fossil specimens that have nothing to do with not only their sex, but the form they took in life at all. These differences can be growth, they can be individual variation among the species, it can be different populations from different areas, pathologies, or taphonomy, the process of fossilization, shifting or morphing the bones into a new shape. All of these can cause changes in the shape of the bones.
Hmm.
And ruling those out is should be necessary to confirm sexual dimorphism. And some of them are very hard to rule out, and there are many studies that did not rule those out before concluding sexual dimorphism, which
Hmm.
is why you'll see many response studies come in and go, well, but we considered this, and when we factor that in, your pattern disappears.
Right.
And so that's another issue. As far as paleontology goes, ontogenetic differences, growth series
Hmm.
is often the most difficult to rule out because if you find members of a species that have horns and don't have horns, is that male and female or adult and young? And
Hmm.
the young just have not developed horns yet. And while we can look into the histology of the bones to figure out the maturity and potential ages of those individuals, the paper I was reading this from, which is a 2017 paper, had noted that no study indicating sexual dimorphism in dinosaurs had also included a skeletochronological age, which is counting the growth rings,
Hmm.
as well in those studies to confirm the age of those individuals.
Yeah. This is part of why it's so tough is that even if you are doing your best with what you have, it's so easy to miss one of the important caveats because there's
Yes,
so many of them.
exactly. So it's really, really hard. And it's why so often you will see things that said this could be indicative of sexual dimorphism, but not
Yes.
say we have found, we have confirmed evidence or we have found that these are sexually dimorphic. It's just that a possible answer is sexual dimorphism.
Hmm.
We'll need way more data to say that more confidently.
And of course, on top of all of those other potential complications, like we mentioned before, a lot of sexual dimorphism is a gradient.
Yep.
So there could be a situation where there is sexual dimorphism, but the overlap is so much that you just won't be able to see it.
Yep.
In that case, you might be able, if it's a species that you know really well, to say, well, there's a 60% chance
Yes.
that if it is this size or shape, that's going to be male or female. But if there's a lot of overlap, you're going to have a really hard time determining that. This is one of the reasons why when people online like to say, well, archaeologists will know what sex you were when they dig up your bones. No, they won't.
No, they won't.
No, they won't. They might be able to make a pretty okay guess,
Mm-hmm.
but we are not that sexually dimorphic as
Yep.
humans. You know how you tell if a archaeological individual was male or female most reliably is you look at what they were buried with.
Yep.
You look
Yep.
at the
Yep.
cultural signs because the way that we culturally treat these categories is far more significant than the way that our bodies actually are physically shaped.
Exactly. The paper criticizing the methodology issues that often show up specifically called out practices like that in anthropology of
Mm-hmm.
too confidently ascribing sex to a skeleton based off of the features or the samples that we have. Despite all of these hurdles, there have been a number of groups where sexual dimorphism has been potentially described. Whether or not it'll stand up to the long-term tests of time, but we have seen a number. And potential examples of sexual dimorphism go back as far back as we have animals.
Yeah.
There was a study looking at Dickinsonia, the ediacaran little Roomba-shaped critter,
Yep. Maybe an animal.
Precambrian, that found that as they grow, throughout their lifespan, they are made out of segments, and the number of segments increases as they grow. But that they would find a distribution of body size with same segmented individuals at very different sizes quite consistently, and no gradient in between. Like, they didn't have a nice scaling from big to small, all with the same number of body segments. They had two categories. They also found that these two groups were roughly a 1-to-1 ratio of the populations, that they were pretty much even.
Okay. A 50-50 split.
A 50-50 split.
Mm-hmm.
And many of the specimens are found in the same areas and layers, which is another issue that comes up with paleontology. If you find two very different shaped groups, but they're at different fossil sites and different ages, those are probably just different species.
Yeah.
Those are probably just different species. This actually happened with some hadrosaurs, where a study noted sexual dimorphism, and then a later study went, those aren't the same age, though. So we think the most likely conclusion is those are different hadrosaurs. So, but here, that doesn't seem to be an issue. So all this seems to indicate that we've got two morphs of Dickinsonia, which could potentially be sexual dimorphism. Now, that'd be very cool. It would show that sexual dimorphism showed up before the Cambrian explosion. One of the questions I had, which I don't know if we have any evidence of, is did Dickinsonia sexually reproduce?
Right.
Did it have sexes?
Was it an animal?
Was it an animal? Does it follow our rules?
Yeah. This is ediacaran.
Yeah. I do think the most up-to-date interpretation of Dickinsonia is that it does seem to be an early animal.
Yes.
But there was another paper that I wasn't able to get the details, but did not find evidence for sexual dimorphism in Dickinsonia that came after this paper. So maybe as far back as the ediacaran, but hard to say. We do have a number of Cambrian fossils that have been noted, but also some complications. One of them was a arthropod called Isoxus. This is a bivalved arthropod. So like, think of like a little shrimp, but it's got two clam shells on either side of its body. And at the front and back of those, it has two spines, a back one and a front one. Front one's longer. And previously, we had noted two morphotypes, one with and without spines, and it was interpreted as sexual dimorphism. A more recent study with more specimens found that it is a growth series, that they start out with no spines and they slowly get longer until they have long spines. So with more data, doesn't seem so. I did find two examples of trilobites that might have sexual dimorphism, and currently no one has disagreed. There was one trilobite that showed two morphs, one having bulbs on the front area, which are interpreted as brood pouches, so most likely female, and that when they look at the populations, they do find growth patterns, but they find growth patterns for both morphs. So not from one morph to the other, they find a growth series for both shapes, with and without the brood pouches.
Cool.
And then another trilobite, they found some of them have specialized limbs that seem very similar to the claspers we see on male horseshoe crabs, which are used for grabbing onto females during mating, and seems to likely be a similar structure. Whether it was used in a similar way is harder to say, but does seem like it's potentially a male type mating structure. And then there are in the fossil record, coming further up after the Cambrian, some very famous examples that are pretty unarguably cases of sexual dimorphism. Probably the most famous, in my opinion, is the Irish elk.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of the best examples because the Irish elk is known for its ridiculous size and ridiculous antlers. This is Megalosaurus. This is one of the biggest deer that ever lived. Could stand at 2 meters or 6.5 feet tall at the shoulders, and was the heaviest known old world deer at 400 to 600 kilograms or 900 to just over 1,000 pounds, and tied with the modern moose for largest known deer after two extinct moose, the giant moose and stag moose. And they had giant antlers that could measure 4.2 meters from tip to tip, 14 feet across, and likely weighed, for the heaviest ones, 40 kilograms or 88 pounds. By far the biggest antlers known from any deer. And antlers are very classically a sexually dimorphic trait. There are deer, like reindeer, where both males and females have antlers, but in many species, only the males have them. I did not find specific mention of confirming that females didn't have them, but in a picture of a male and female skeleton, the female skull did not seem like it had any attachment points for antlers. But I didn't see that. I wasn't able to find that description for sure.
Yeah.
But they also note major sexual dimorphism in size. They do have two different size categories in the skeletons. There is dimorphism in the skulls, with males having a wider, flatter skull, likely to hold the antlers.
Mm-hmm.
So some animals, it does seem like we have a pretty solid indication. And this is not a rare fossil animal as compared to some others.
Yes.
One fossil site that has over 100 individuals alone, they are a well-known fossil animal that has very dramatic features, all which seem to point towards sexual dimorphism.
This is also an extremely recent animal. This is
Yes.
Ice Age, which means that they have very, very close relatives today.
Exactly.
So we can look at them and say, like, if we found something with antlers from 50 million years ago, it would be much more of a long shot to say those that must have been males and females, because today antlers are only males. This is a group that is around today. This is only, tens of thousands of years ago. It's unlikely to have changed very much, which helps a lot with being able to compare directly with species we have around today.
Exactly. When we move farther back and look at things like dinosaurs, it does become trickier. There are studies that have indicated potential sexual dimorphism in a number of dinosaur groups. Some famous ones, like Tyrannosaurus, sexual dimorphism has been suggested, mostly in bones of the body. Proportions of limb bones and body size does seem to indicate two size morphs of T-Rex, but nothing incredibly dramatic. Like, one study that looked at it found dimorphism in the long bones, so the limb bones, but not in the rest of the skeleton per se. Another study did indicate in the ischium bones, so the hip region and pelvis region, that the angle of those bones compared to the spinal column is different in two morphs, and that one, the angle allows more space and could therefore be females, allowing for the passing of eggs. But other papers and people have responded to point out that dinosaur eggs are not that big compared to them. So assuming that a difference in pelvis might be due to that, it might not be that important as compared to us mammals who have to pass a relatively large baby. There was another one that found potential evidence for retractable penises like we see in crocodilians, because in crocodilians, for male crocs, the first tail vertebra, which anchors the penis muscles, is the same size as those following it, and in females, it's smaller. And they found that same pattern in T-Rex and some troodontids, and the female morph, the one lacking the evidence for this specialized tailbone, were the larger, more robust morph, which is what had been interpreted earlier, that those were most likely the females. But another study that looked at 36 alligators did not find any pattern in the tailbones.
Which is another way that these studies can fall apart, is if it's based on a comparison to something today. that also doesn't hold up.
Yes, exactly. That's not, if it turns out not to actually be as consistent as you thought, it
Yep.
is not going to be good evidence anymore. Doesn't mean it's wrong.
Yes. That's the line
Yeah.
running underneath all of these is it's not that we're saying there wasn't sexual dimorphism in these ancient animals. It's just that it's so hard to say with certainty.
Beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yes.
Another group that often comes up are ceratopsians with their big horns and frills. They're a really ideal candidate to look for sexual dimorphism, and it has been described in some groups.
Yeah. They also are often preserved in giant assemblages.
Yes.
With tons of skeletons. So you get a big sample size.
And that was something I forgot to mention when we were talking about sample sizes, is using bone beds is one of the ways to combat sample sizes, because that's typically a single species, large groups, all same age, really ideal. But those don't exist for every species. They only exist for certain groups. Ceratopsians being one of those. We have found patterns in like Chasmosaurus where two groups were found with different shaped brow horns. So the horns above the eyes, one had more curved and pointed forwards, and the other was more straight and pointed more upward. The more upward pointing horns were also on the larger specimens of the two groups. So these were interpreted as the males, potentially used for a similar shoving match. This is also something in a time, and I think it's good to mention this, very often in these, they will establish we're interpreting these as males because of patterns today with mostly mammals.
Right.
While that's not unreasonable, there's no way for us to confirm that the females were not the ones that were more dominant, and it was maybe a matriarchal society and the females were competing for territory. We don't know.
Which is another thing that we didn't really directly mention this earlier, that we were talking about what is the function of these different morphs. And for mammals, much of the time, the big males are doing those competitions and such. And when you don't have a lot of competition, you have less sexual dimorphism. But there are species today where the females are the ones doing the displays or doing the competing. So it's not as common today, but there's no reason that it couldn't have been the reverse situation back during any of these other time periods.
Yeah. Some of these studies, you'll see them put male and female in quotes, where it's like,
yeah,
we have to distinguish, and saying type 1 and type 2 is not as clear and communicative as male and female, but we're going to call one of them male, one of them female, and we're going to use similar trends we see in modern animals. But very often those indications were not based off of a sexual indicator.
Yes. Well, and in particular with dinosaurs, it would be arguably easier for females to be the big ones who are doing the fighting, because they don't have to carry a whole gestation period's worth of growing offspring inside. Dinosaurs universally laid pretty small eggs.
Yep.
So you could more easily get away with being the big one, the one doing the fighting, and also the one making eggs.
Yep. And like we said with female fecundity, now you could lay more eggs than you would if you were smaller. So it actually is directly bolstering the number of offspring you're potentially having.
And if you aren't taking care of the offspring, or if the males are taking care of the nests and the offspring, then that releases some of that additional pressure. So yeah, and again, we see this in some animals today. There are birds that do this.
Absolutely.
Where it's like, yeah, the females are the flashy ones, the ones putting on a display. Then they lay eggs, and the males take care of the nest.
Yeah, and the female either does other jobs or leaves entirely.
Yeah, then goes and mates again.
Yep. So like, it is not unreasonable to think that the animal with a showier or bigger or more ornate features is the male. But unless you actually have evidence showing male sex for those groups, you are just applying a modern pattern to this fossil group. Another dinosaur that has had a lot of potential support is Protoceratops.
Yeah.
There have been a bunch of studies. This is a very numerous fossil animal. We have tons of Protoceratops fossils. We have very nice growth series, and dimorphism has been found in the frill size being wider and taller in one group and less so in the other, and greater body size in that larger frilled group, though they did note that they still get to roughly the same adult body size for the two morphs, but two different frills, and that the nose horn, which they don't have like a pokey horn, but they do have a bump, is more pronounced in the larger frilled group. Because we have very nice growth series, it has been interpreted that these do seem to be two individual groups, and that the horns and frills become these two morphs later in life.
Yeah, I was gonna say the fun thing with establishing a growth series is if you have sexual dimorphism in your growth series, then your growth trajectory will be shaped like a Y,
Yes.
where it'll be a stock that is the same for everybody, and then you reach adulthood, and now there's two growth series that split off from there because males and females are growing and developing differently.
Well, it's how like students in elementary school, it's pretty across the board, and then puberty hits and differences start to show up.
Yes.
And it's why most voice actors for little boy cartoon characters are women, because yeah, little boy voices and little girl voices sound the same.
Yes, because we're not dimorphic at that age.
Yes. But for Protoceratops, some studies, more recent studies, have not found the same patterns. These two I like because of they came at it with a different approach. It wasn't just a better sample.
Mm-hmm.
One study looked at the skulls in silhouette. So they took silhouettes of the top view and the side view, and then they did comparisons that way. So just a simpler form, but they did it, and they found no clear separation between the quote male and female morphs that other studies had determined. At least in the frill, there was a little bit of dimorphism in the nose horn area.
Okay.
So potentially changing the way you look at it may or may not support the pattern. Another study took 4 features of the skull: the postorbital width of the skull, the nasal height, the width of the frill, and the height of the frill. And then they gave each feature a score, with -1 being male trait that had been described, and +1 being female trait expression, and a score of -4, with all of them being the described male morph, would mean male, and a score of 4, +4, would indicate female, with all of them being the female morph.
Right.
And they said only a few specimens represented the male or female grouping consistently. Many of them only partially corresponded.
Yeah.
We're in that gradient that we've been talking about.
Which, again, could mean that this isn't sexual dimorphism, or that it is sexual dimorphism and there's just a whole lot of overlap.
Yeah. That some males have smaller frills and some females have bigger frills.
Yep.
And just every now and then you get ones that cross over the midline into the other size range. Another kind of famous example in dinosaurs was in Apatosaurus, Diplodocus, and Camarasaurus. There was a pattern that was noticed in roughly 50% of Apatosaurus and Diplodocus and 25% of Camarasaurus. Some specimens had fused vertebrae at the base of the tail.
Okay.
And that this did not seem to be due to healed injury, and it did seem to be a biological feature. And the suggestion that was made is that maybe this allowed for a continued or specialized positioning of the tail during mating.
Right.
And that these with this feature would be females more able to move the tail out of the way during mating. It was found in roughly half the population in 2 of the species. It seems to be consistent, but even though, as the paper I found described it, every specimen available in North America was used for that study, that only amounted to 18 skeletons.
Yeah, this is the sample size issue.
Yep.
18 is an awesome number of sauropods to have.
So cool.
But if you bring 18 to a statistician, they'll tell you to walk. They'll tell you to turn around and leave.
Yep. That is not enough to confirm. Doesn't mean this isn't exactly what they have proposed it could be.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not enough to say it confidently. You also get situations where suggestions have been made, like the length of sauropod necks have also been suggested to maybe be sexually selected, like has been suggested for giraffes, which could make more sense since some of them do not seem to be using their long necks to reach higher up for food, but are low browsers. But it, once again, like the giraffes, doesn't explain why, if it's selected in males or in females, why the other sex also has them.
Yeah.
Similar situations have come up with the crests of hadrosaurs, where we've noted narrower female and more robust male crests in some groups, but often the sample sizes are small. And in that one example, it was found that these two groups were two different ages and therefore likely different species. But some have suggested that the opposite might also be the case, that when we have two different species that have been identified at the same age and site, maybe those were males and females. And that's the other thing that can happen, like we've had with different aged dinosaurs that we've discussed in other episodes and newses, being found out to actually be the same dinosaur, just a weird looking baby and a weird looking adult. The opposite could happen here, where we might have different species that are actually just males and females of dinosaurs, but they look so different, we have identified them differently. There are many other examples. Stegosaurus, Pachycephalosaurs have come up, other dinosaurs have come up. To wrap up discussing the evidence of sexual dimorphism in dinosaurs, the most recent study of all of these that I took notes on was one that did a review of studies that purported or proposed evidence for sexual dimorphism in dinosaurs. They looked at 9 species: Protoceratops, Stegosaurus, Allosaurus, Plateosaurus, Stegosaurus, Tyrannosaurus, Coelophysis, and Kentrosaurus, and put them through more rigorous and modern statistical analysis, and found not any of them showed statistically significant evidence for sexual dimorphism, which is most of the examples I just discussed.
And this is how it tends to go. Is you find some potentially promising evidence, and then a second or third look often casts a lot of doubt on it.
So were dinosaurs sexually dimorphic? Almost certainly. Which ones were sexually dimorphic? We have suspicions.
Yes. Which sex is which?
Yep.
Hard to say. Well, and I think that this really drives home a point that we should also apply to the first half of our discussion, which is that we have all of these really cool examples of sexual dimorphism in our modern world, but those struggle just as much from these same sorts of exceptions and overlaps. Like we said, you'll get a female that has tusks for some reason, or a male that's small for some reason. And once you lose a lot of the information about the surrounding population, and when you're really just handed a random handful of individuals of a species, it becomes almost impossible to discern, is there sexual dimorphism here? Which parts of the body are dimorphic? Which sex is which? Especially if you're handed a bunch of random individuals, but you're only given parts of the body. Right? If you're not given internal organs, and you're not given genitals, and you're just handed like a croc skull, absent of the information of who else it lived with. Because like we said, there isn't actually a binary here.
No.
There are trends, and in some species, they're very dramatic trends. And it would be so cool to find definitive evidence that like Triceratops was one of that it's like, Triceratops was like polar bears. And
exactly.
One sex was twice as big as the other sex, and they were having these big old fights, which is completely plausible totally could have been true, but actually trying to find where that line is so difficult.
Well, and we run into all those issues of the information we're missing. Like you said, you're missing a bunch of the soft tissue, which not only means you're missing identifying features, you might be missing the sexually dimorphic feature, like
Yeah.
feathers, color, skin texture, display structures. If it's all soft tissue, that's not going to be
Mhm.
helpful. And if we do have a situation like the polar bear, if I gave you 2 fossil bears, one was twice the mass of the other, would your first assumption be those are the same species of bear?
Right.
And even if you do suspect that, how are you going to prove it without genetic information or really, really ideally fossilized situations where like they fossilized in a burrow together with young?
Right.
Like you found a family group at
Yep.
we
One of
can run
them-
into so many confusions.
One of them was upset because someone was sleeping in its bed.
Yes, yep. You have one standing in front of each bed with their hands on their hips.
Yes. And an empty bowl of porridge.
And then a curled up Neanderthal in the
Just
biggest bed.
A little Neanderthal, just a tiny little Neanderthal in a dress.
And so like it's so easy to get muddled. And like we're saying, even with today's groups, even if you have a very clear signal, polar bears or whatever it is, very clearly 2 strong morphs that are obvious, why those exist is hard to say.
Yep.
There have been so many times where we've been like, look, the male has this because obviously it's selected by the female. And then when we look at it, we go, oh, actually the females don't care about that structure.
Yep.
When we test the variables, it's the color that they care about, not the feather. It's the it's the song, it's the dance. If we plucked the male, but they still did the dance well, then the female doesn't care, or
Yes.
vice versa. If we put those feathers on anything, the female goes crazy for it.
Mm-hmm.
It is very easy to look at a situation and go, this is why the male is bigger. And it goes, well, no, actually, the male hunts different things than the female. So the male has to be bigger because it's taking on bigger prey. The size doesn't actually come into it, because like with polar bears, that's not due to male competition all the time because there's not so many males that they're constantly competing.
Yeah.
I'm sure it helps when it does come up, but they don't live in large social groups where you're going to be fighting off 12 males to maintain your harem of females. You might not meet a female this mating season because the closest one is too many miles away.
Mm-hmm.
So noticing sexual dimorphism, much easier than explaining it.
Yes.
And confirming it in fossils, sometimes just not really possible.
Yeah, I don't know of a single example of unargued this is sexual dimorphism in the fossil record.
Yeah. Yep.
There's a bunch of convincing cases. There was we talked about a news recently that was a bird, I think it was a Cretaceous bird with big showy feathers.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, yeah, those are display feathers. Probably a male,
Mm-hmm.
but not every species of bird today that has big showy display features are they on the males. Sometimes they're on the females. There was that study, I don't remember if this was published or if we talked about it, that was looking at the patterns of injuries on the spines of certain hadrosaurs that looked like they were mating injuries. And they were saying, yeah, this looks like injuries caused by mating. So this could be an indicator of these are the females because the males are climbing on top. But when we talked about it, our discussion was, well, but that mounting behavior happens for lots of reasons between lots of different individuals. That isn't just something that... So it's so difficult. And really what it comes down to is that sexual behavior in animals is so preposterously varied because, again, it's under such strong selective pressures that it tends to become diverse and extreme and variable, that there's an exception to every pattern. Yes. And when there's an exception to every pattern, it becomes really hard to identify a clear pattern.
Yep. Yeah. If you can always question the pattern that you are using. In many ways, it becomes almost not a pattern at all. Like, there's a million more things and examples we could go over. This is an immensely dense topic. But for now, we will wrap up our discussion of sexual dimorphism. As always, check things out and let us know what we skipped. Tell us what your favorite example is or what you would like to hear us talk about, and make requests for any specifics that we didn't cover here. But before we sign off completely, one last section, which is our patron question. Every episode, we like to answer one of the questions submitted to us by one of our patrons, which you get to do at certain levels on our Patreon. David, what's our question?
This episode's question comes from Fairsaw, who asks, why is it so rare for us to see horned theropod dinosaurs like Carnotaurus and Majungasaurus? What made crests so much more common?
Very good question, and feels very fitting for our
Yeah.
discussion of sexual dimorphism and display structures and all that. And the truest answer is, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, part of it is, Carnotaurus and Majungasaurus notably are both abelisaurs.
Yep.
So they are related to each other. You do get a variety of like bumps and ridges. Like T-Rex and Allosaurus have those like crests, but the kind of blurring the line between a horn and a crest.
Yes.
But we don't get a lot of horns on theropod dinosaurs. But also, we don't get a lot of horns on predators in general.
Exactly. We haven't mentioned it this episode, but those kinds of display structures are pretty commonly herbivore traits.
Yeah.
Not predator traits. Even when you go into things like birds, predatory birds aren't the ones with bright red and blue plumage with long, intricate feathers.
Mm-hmm.
Wolves and bears and crocodiles and snakes don't tend to have big, crazy display structures. Why that is, there's multiple reasons, and it's going to depend on which group you look at. But generally, when you come to herbivores versus predators, they're under very different pressures as to what it takes to survive.
Mm-hmm.
Predators have to chase down and catch their food, or overpower it, or ambush it. So you'll see that the vast majority of their biology is in line with that goal.
Yeah, they tend to be streamlined. They tend to be lighter weight. There's not
ergonomic.
A lot. Yeah, they're ergonomic. There's not a lot of bells and whistles. There's not a lot of stuff to get in the way. And as fun as it is to depict it in movies and cartoons and stuff, horns aren't helpful for catching prey.
Nope.
That's not really what they're good for. You've got teeth, you've got claws, and that's really what you want to use for chasing down and catching prey. A dinosaur like T-Rex with a skull-like Triceratops. I did want to, when I was in high school, I think, I went through a phase of drawing as many different types of dragons as I could possibly think of.
Yeah.
And one of them was a roughly dinosaur, like theropod-shaped dragon with a Triceratops head.
Mm-hmm.
And even in the picture, you look at it and you're like, that's not going to work.
Yep.
That's just not how that shape would be. That's too much weight on the front of the head. That's too much bulk getting in the way. Those tend not to be. Those are great defensive and display structures, but they're not good for hunting.
Well, I think of that with dragons when it comes to long-necked dragons. And it's like, well, you're shaped more like a sauropod now, so why would you be eating meat?
Yes.
You have reduced the size of prey you can capture significantly for your massive body. Herbivores, though, you get the different pressure of many of them are social to defend from predators. And that leads to pressures of social hierarchy and competition. So these display structures become more important now for their social dynamic. And if you're going to grow horns, that also can be defensive against predators. So there's more benefits. If predators have a disagreement, they've already got the armament to fight if they really want to.
Yes. And in the examples that we do see, like Carnotaurus is really notable for those big horns above the eyes. Ceratosaurus has that big horn on the nose, but those aren't really all that big. in the grand
Mhm.
scheme of things, right? They don't really affect the profile of the head all that much. They still maintain a very theropod shape.
Yes.
It really, yeah, you really don't want to have something that is disrupting that shape of the body. The one really big deal notable exception among theropods of this sort of streamlined rule of thumb is Spinosaurus,
Yes.
which has that massive crest along the back, but more and more evidence is suggesting that Spinosaurus wasn't hunting like other theropod dinosaurs.
Yep.
That Spinosaurus had a different diet and a different approach, and so could probably get away with that structure because it
Yes.
it wasn't interfering with something the same way that it might have for something like T-Rex or Carnotaurus.
So I think one of the biggest reasons that it's not particularly conducive for predators to be so heavily ornamented. Another reason to for the specific comparison of horns to crests is
Mhm.
that in many groups it has been suggested that those crests aren't as heavily for display, but like Allosaurus's crests, I've seen it suggested might be helping their vision, acting kind of like blinders in a regard or shading the eye,
Mhm.
and that they might also be a structural purpose
Yes.
instead of just a display purpose.
The other thing about a crest is that a crest can support a large soft structure.
Yes.
So like you see like a lot of lizards today will have that crest on the chin or on the throat, and that's a big display, but that's soft tissue and they can fold it up when they
Yes.
need it to be out of the way. Horns don't really work that way.
Yep.
And in theropods, it might be that you had this big crest that was supporting a big plume of feathers or something.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're not using it, you can just put those feathers down like a cockatiel.
Yeah. Well, because once again, like we were saying, the bright colors on a male bird of paradise is a detriment because it makes you more obvious to a predator. So you're going to be a target more often. But if you're a brightly colored male predator, you starve to death.
Yes, you're a bad predator.
Like that's like why we don't see albino predators almost ever out in the wild, because regardless of how you're hunting, getting closer to your prey undetected is a requirement in almost every predatory strategy out there.
Mm-hmm.
Minus if you're like a trapdoor spider. Like,
yeah, even the examples that I can think of today of predators that do have like horned chameleons are really
yes.
the
Yep.
one really big example where you've got like full triceratops horns on a lizard,
Yes.
but they hunt bugs with their projectile tongues.
Yeah, the
So
bug doesn't
that's-
even know they're there.
Yes, that's a completely different. You can get away with it probably for a similar reason as Spinosaurus. You're just
Yes.
doing something fundamentally different. This is the hypothesis that hasn't been accepted yet, is that Spinosaurus was hunting fish with its huge projectile tongue. It's like a cone
We just
snake.
got to find that hyoid
Yeah.
with the javelin coming out of it that
There's a
chameleons have.
harpoon.
Every time I see a chameleon, the throat bone that's around the voice box is what the hyoid is for everybody. The chameleons have one that is so ridiculous because it's what the tongue launches off of.
Mhm.
It's uncomfortable picturing that in one's own throat. That much infrastructure.
Episode 192, tongues.
So yeah, the exact answer is hard to pin down. Like, why does Carnosaurus and Majungasaurus have such elaborate displays? It could be how they're courting. It could be what their social structure is like. They were more isolated from a lot of other predatory dinosaur groups. So we might be getting a situation where they went on a kind of unique path down there than the norm that we see across the rest of the groups of predators. Who knows? It's hard to say for sure, but generally, yeah, we don't expect to see them because they're not as useful. Absolutely excellent question, Fairsaw. Thank you for submitting it. And with that, we can start wrapping things up. If you have questions or want to learn more about sexual dimorphism, check out the blog post. There'll be links and pictures there. As we already said, get into the Discord and tell us what your favorite example of sexual dimorphism is. I'm sure we skipped some of people's absolute favorites. There are so many cool ones out there. Don't forget to check out Pokemon Sand and Bone. Those episodes are coming out now. We got Dragon Con coming up soon, so more announcements to come on that. Thank you to everyone who requested this topic. It was a ton of fun. Thank you and welcome to our new patrons, and extra special thanks to our top tier patrons, Sarah May, Jeff Ellington, and Danielle Loves Bugs. And that's about it. I don't have any other thoughts on sexual dimorphism. This was
said all of it.
We did it. We're done. There's no more to be said. No more studies to be done. We have.
This is it. We've learned everything. There'll be another episode.
Yeah.
In 2 weeks. Weeks are dimorphic for Common Descent. Right? It's either a week with a new episode or it's a week without it.
Absolutely. Yes. Yep. That is the pattern that you'll find. Listeners, how much dimorphism that is there between a David episode and a Will episode?
Ooh.
How
interesting. How much is there? How much host dimorphism is there?
How many of you? Here's an actual question, because this is something that we've discussed. How many of you could tell the difference between a David or Will episode without hearing the hellos at the beginning? Like, how many is for you? Is it clear, or how many of you can you not tell the difference? Because we have that happen quite often.
And a follow-up question: how many of you didn't know there were David and Will episodes until we just said
yes.
it? That's come
Absolutely.
up a bunch. We've had a bunch of people who are like, I didn't realize that there was like an alternating pattern. Yeah, there has been the whole time.
Yep.
So, which is to say, it does answer the question a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. It's
not that much.
Is our dimorphism not statistically significant?
No, I don't think it is.
Just the same person.
When they dig up the podcast in 1,000 years, no one's going to be able to tell the difference between a David episode and a Will episode.
This podcast was run by one very busy person.
One very busy, very talkative person who really liked their own jokes. All right, let's leave.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the Common Descent Podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.